Beside me is Amy Bernard, our other co-leader. Let us welcome each and every one of you here. We're especially grateful for the working group that's here, and then any guests that are present. I do want to be sure to reiterate that we're incredibly grateful for the hospitality of Porter Ridge High School and Rashawn Harris, who is the principal here. And we got spoiled tonight, and that's not an overstatement. We got spoiled tonight by the Porter Ridge High School Culinary Arts Academy, and their leader and their person in charge of them and their growth in the culinary arts is Robert Filter. So we certainly do want to mention that, and we are so grateful for their hospitality and generosity tonight. Okay. Amy and I are going to kind of wing this together. So this is our first live and ready to go kind of moving forward. So we'll do this together. What you call the meeting to order?
Okay, so I guess then this meeting is called to order. And what other formalities do I need to do? Well,
one thing we certainly need is to get to the agenda and approve that.
Does everyone
have a copy of the agenda in front of you?
Could I ask the two of you for 1 minute, please? I would like to state publicly, if I could, just to take a minute. We had a horrible accident Monday, just right over the road here. And I want to say to the county commissioners, but especially to Cindy and the sheriff's department and the EMTs, the emergency response, what a fabulous job and what a well-oiled machine it was. That there was no turf fighting, there was no anything. It was just all people working together for children. And I want to thank everybody publicly because they are all of our children. Cindy and I talked about that a few minutes ago. And I just want to thank you for, and I wouldn't expect anything any differently, but I think all of our hearts were touched. And thank you very much for such rapid response and taking such good care of our children, all of our children. Excuse me for doing that, but I just feel like we needed to say that.
No, I appreciate that. I think we all feel the same way and hope we can continue that spirit on tonight.
Okay. At this time, is there a motion to approve the agenda for tonight?
I'll make the motion.
Okay.
Motion to approve tonight's agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Then I guess those stand approved. I don't think we need to vote on that, do we? So we'll approve the agenda. You also received the minutes, and thank you so much, Ms. Coto, for getting those minutes to us. And Lynn West, let's please name Lynn West. Thank you, Lynn. And okay, Ms. Amos. Okay, Kevin. Okay, and do we need to vote? Okay, I thought we surely will probably need to vote on the minutes. All those in favor of approving the minutes, would you please raise your hand? And opposed? Okay, great. All right.
Okay, so we are moving right on to the first presentation, which is about potential funding options.
Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about some financing tools. At the last meeting, the discussion was we wanted to kind of talk about how would we approach funding the capital plan. As we know, our charge ultimately is to come up with a long-term capital plan funding strategy for the UCPS needs, both short-term and long-term. Without having a little more detail about what the projects are, because I know Mike and his group and the school's staff are working diligently together. But I wanted to just take a step back and kind of give you that introduction, if you will, to the types of funding tools we have, answer questions, and give you a chance to ask questions of me and talk about, all the different tools that are available to the county and funding different things. I teach this class for the Government Finance Officers Association. So it does have a little bit of an academic spin to it, I think, as Amy observed earlier in the week when we were talking about this presentation. And if you have a question, please feel free to stop me and ask you. If I'm moving too fast or something doesn't quite make sense, please stop. So for today's discussion, what we want to look at is our goal is really to discuss and inform. We're trying to educate our committee as well as the folks at home, because funding capital is a complicated process, can be a complicated process. And I'm going to give you some guidelines tonight. I can tell you every one of them doesn't exactly fit every situation. So it's kind of a very fact-dependent, case-specific process. I'm not really going to be talking about capacity. At the end, we'll talk about kind of where the county funding comes from and kind of where it goes. But as far as capacity for projects, that really is going to be dependent upon the types of projects that come out of the capital plan and the need and prioritization of those. Once we have that kind of schedule, we can talk about the capacity and how those relate then to funding impact. We're going to talk about some of the process that we go through as we're trying to decide on how to fund projects, kind of the filter, if you will, how we distill down to actually getting a funding plan. Some pay-as-you-go options, particularly pros and cons, debt instruments. I want to review some examples, kind of give you some yes and no's, and then I'll give you a lot of maybes. And then talk about kind of the process, how once we understand what the needs are, how we'll go about doing or how we'll go about putting together and constructing a funding plan recommendation. And then again, at the end, we'll talk about where the funding comes from and where it goes. And those that commission and school board probably have seen that slide about 100 times. So it won't be new to you, but some folks watching at home, folks new to our committee, may not have seen that. So we'll talk just a little bit about that. So fundamental concepts. If you remember back to the October meeting, one of the things you'll hear us talk about a lot is kind of balance in our approach. And when we talk about balance, we talk about a lot of different things. And the first one we have listed here is generational equity. And what do we mean by generational equity? And it's a concept that kind of sits throughout government and government finance that's called intergenerational equity. And basically all it means is that the users of the asset, or the users of whatever you're doing, should be the payers for the asset. So you see it a lot of times when you're dealing with water and sewer rates. If you were to charge the last 20 years water rates to pay for the future 20 years water plant, then the previous 20 years users have paid for that water plant. But what you would do instead then is, for instance, finance the water plant, and the users of that water plant over that 20-year span will be the ones responsible to pay for it through their annual water rate. So we're always looking for that generational balance. So for those things that are intergenerational in nature, like a school, we want a school to last 30, 40, 50 years, or beyond, depending upon which school it is in the county, you would want to be sure you stretch that over the users, not the folks that came before that didn't get the use of that asset. So we're always trying to strike that balance between the users and the payers. Okay. The next step, we're looking at affordability and sustainability. When we're talking about funding, we have to balance capital needs against the ability to pay. It's just no different than in your daily life. You can't afford to do something at your house, you can't afford it, or you have to figure out a different way to pay for it. So what we're always trying to do is balance that capital need approach to the residents' ability to pay, because ultimately at the end of the day, it's the same taxpayers in Union County for all of us that are using those assets. So we're always trying to balance that ability to pay against the capital needs. We want to ensure that what we fund on a capital basis doesn't reach the point where it is too onerous, if you will, on the taxpayer or the ratepayer. Project balance, reinvestment versus expanding capacity. A good capital program, and I know Dr. Webb leads us also in discussing, has two major components. It's the reinvestment in your current assets, essentially revitalization, replacement and repair program, and also expanding capacity when needed. So your program, if it's weighted too heavily toward expansion, as I think probably we experienced in the 2000s, we were expanding so fast we weren't able to do the necessary maintenance, and we've kind of found ourselves with some maintenance needs have grown up. So if you have to have a balance in your capital program, that reinvestment versus expanding capacity. Ideally, you're doing a little bit of both all the time. And then prioritization. You have to balance today against tomorrow. We talk a lot about projects and how we've appropriated funds. Commission appropriates funds for specific projects, but sometimes things come up that you're not aware of, or things break, and you have to address those. So you really have to prioritize what you have sitting on your plate. And from time to time, you have to move the things from tomorrow's list to today's list, and move things from today's list to tomorrow's list, which is it's not really different than I think everybody does in their own home. When something breaks, you reprioritize your personal resources to try to address them. And I think in prioritization, when we're looking at a capital program, you have to do that. Asset life matching. This is the simple concept. I think we talked a little bit about it last time, is you wouldn't go and borrow a 20-year mortgage to finance a refrigerator, because most refrigerators aren't going to last 20 years. Just the same way, when you're matching assets to your debt, you don't want to borrow debt for something that's not going to last the life of the debt. Okay, so this becomes real important when we start talking about using bonds to build things or to replace things. Because, for instance, if you were to come in and you wanted to put in bleachers and you wanted to use a 25-year bond to do that, that's probably not the best asset life match to have, or kitchen equipment with debt. But if you're talking about adding a wing to a school or a replacement school, that's a 20-year, 30-year, 40-year asset. And it makes perfect sense then to have that be a debt-funded item. So this concept becomes real important, and what ends up happening in that process is we take the list of projects, same thing we would do with all our county projects, and we look at them and we kind of qualify them. We say, this is something that's probably matches the debt life. This would be something we wouldn't be able to debt fund. For instance, a lot of IT stuff has about a 5-year lifespan, 5 to 10-year lifespan. You wouldn't want to go out and borrow 20-year notes to fund an IT project. Operating budget impact, project materiality. The other part, and we talked a lot about this last time, is what actually becomes a capital project. So I think it's important to understand the relationship of your capital project to the remainder of your program. Operating budget impact, the other piece is you have to be careful, or you have to ensure that as you develop your capital plan, you're not building something you can't operate. Okay, I'm sure we've all read stories where cities and towns have built fire stations but can't afford to put firefighters or fire trucks in. Just like you wouldn't want to build a school if you can't afford to put teachers, desks, library books, and all the stuff that you need to open the doors to that school. So you need to understand how those projects are going to impact the operations side. Because capital money, we can go debt, we can do pay-go, and that's one-time money. But that operating budget impact is an ongoing requirement. It's not something that's going to go away. Okay? So if you have, for instance, like if you build a new building, you want to be sure that you have enough money on the operating side of it, you plan accordingly to maintain it, to heat it, light it, all those different things. So these are just some of the, some of the key things that we look at when we start talking about capital projects. And then organizational risk tolerance. And what we mean by that is how far if you remember back to our today, tomorrow balance, sometimes an organization can be willing to push things out further into the future if the resources aren't available. And I think that, that's that decision of how soon do I fix it, or is there a short interim fix related to whatever that problem is. Oh, sorry, going the wrong way. Does that kind of make sense for everyone before I move on? And these are just kind of key fundamental concepts. When we start looking at how we fund things, we kind of take the whole pile of projects. And I wish I could say it was more scientific than this, but we do. We sit down and we go through each project, and a lot of times we'll list them on a board, or now we use PowerPoint, or we use a spreadsheet thrown up on the wall, and we put them in columns, and we say these are things that would be debt funded, these are things that can be cash funded, or ask these questions.
Jeff, could you give us an example of organizational risk tolerance?
Okay, sure.
Yep.
Probably the best example would be, let's say you have a roof that leaks. Okay, we're familiar with leaky roofs. And you decide if that's a patch job or if it's a full new roof. So a patch job is really probably an operating issue. and it doesn't cost as much. But if you've reached the point where you've done too many patches and you're no longer at your risk level, and you think you are putting the building or the envelope, what I call the building envelope, at greater risk, then you may want to move from patch to full replacement. So you have to understand what your tolerance levels are as an organization.
That's good.
You see a lot of times on the city side, street ratings, you probably do the same thing with facility and roof ratings, is how far down, you do a core sample, you take a look, how far down does the shingles go, or how far down does the covering go, and kind of what the tolerance is for that. So you reach a point where, as far as an organization, your concern is more of catastrophic failure than the ability to patch it. And every organization has a different level of tolerance for that. So you need to understand, and as a group, and Mike, as he does his work with his staff, they have to understand how far their organization is willing to take a roof before they would recommend replacement. Or if you're talking about a building, for instance, if you're talking about elementary school, and you want to put the identified needs $3 million and the cost to replace the elementary school is 15, does it make more sense to replace it
Right.
than to invest $3 million?
Right.
Because $3 million may buy you 5 years, 15 million may buy you 30. But that's a question organizationally that has to kind of be analyzed and understood going forward. Does that?
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you. It's helpful.
Is that fairly clear for everyone? So really, it's as you get down to financing tools and kind of how you finance capital projects, there's really three significant tools that counties use. They use PAYGO funding, which essentially is cash, current operating revenue, or some other liquid asset or some other asset that you turn to cash and use that cash. Debt funding and financing. And recently, or in the last 10 years, these concepts of P3s have popped up. And when we talk about P3s, we're talking about public-private partnerships, build-to-suit, leaseback options. I won't spend a ton of time on that because I think later we'll probably have more conversation about that as a group. There's pros and cons to doing those, and they just have to be kind of analyzed on an individual case-by-case basis. But for tonight, what I really want to talk about more is the PAYGO and the debt funding process.
Jeff, excuse me, can I ask a
Sure.
question? As you're going through these fundamental concepts, are you saying that we as a group should use these fundamental concepts?
What I'm
Is that what you're
suggesting
suggesting, or?
is that as at some point in this process, whether it is at a staff level or at a committee level, and this is can't be a complicated process, it's probably more suited at the staff level for discussion at this level. Someone will take these concepts and apply them to the proposed project package. And that is how then you will determine which tool is appropriate. So at the end, I'll show you, I have a checkbox. If you skip ahead in the presentation, there's yes, no, kind of approach. But kind of what I'm suggesting is, as we were talking financing concepts and how do you determine what tools you use, that this is the filter or check boxes that you kind of, these are all the things you consider when deciding, am I going to bond fund that? Am I going to PAYGO? Are we going to use a lease option? Those kinds of different things.
Yeah, because I mean, for instance, I look at prioritization, and we've discussed that the Board of Education will come up through the CCEP process. They'll come up with the plan and the priorities. So you're not saying that that's something that we as a group need to do, but that we need to address the long-term funding for it, right?
Right. What I'm suggesting is, and this is in the very last few slides, is
Maybe
that
I'm asking questions that'll be
that's okay.
answered later.
No problem. As we jump to kind of that prioritization,
Mhm.
what we'll then say is, okay, here's the list of priorities. Here's our available funding sources.
Mhm.
Okay. How do you then marry those two lists?
Through extension of time or shuffling of the list or
Yes.
whatever the case.
And then as part of that process goes, because what we're going to find out is you essentially have these three buckets. Sorry, going the wrong way. You have really kind of two major tools. We can talk about P3s another time. But it's either going to be PAYGO or it's probably going to be debt service or debt of some kind. So then of that prioritized list, how do you slot over a multi-year period each of those projects into their appropriate funding source and their appropriate prioritization? So literally when you do this in a process on the staff side, when we do it, we sit with a big board and we move the projects around and watch the numbers move to get them in balance with the available resources. So it's the process that you kind of go through in evaluating these things to understand and know where you have to slot those and to know what the appropriate funding is.
And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be dense, but what I'm trying to say is, I don't know that it's necessarily our mandate to prioritize the projects as a group.
I think you'll have to prioritize them. Someone will have to prioritize them.
I was going to
whether
say it's
it's
the Board of Education.
Board of Education, the facilities committee, someone is going to have to come back to this group
I
and say,
was just trying to.
these
understand
50
how
projects
these things fit into-
are 1 through 50 on the list.
I think I might can provide a little bit of clarity there. I think when we come back to our March meeting, I think it's sometime in early March, it's after our March board meeting, the facilities committee will have met multiple times to have winnowed down to a number and to some priorities, and then that will go to the full board. And at the March meeting, the full board will determine what we believe the priorities to be, and then we will send those over to the county, and then they will do that fund matching, what you were talking about on the board and that kind of thing.
That's what I was trying to understand, is how you were relating these concepts to what we as a group are chartered to do.
So let me follow up to Emily. What are we to do if we are not prioritizing or coming up with the funding source? What can we help with?
Well, I think, and you might jump in if I'm mistaken, but what I see the charge of this group is to take that prioritization, take a funding recommendation from staff, and I think it's probably going to be a joint effort between Mike and our staff and his staff to come up with a recommended, here's how a recommended approach should be. But I think ultimately this group still has to come up with that plan and a recommendation to both boards on the funding strategy and the scheduling of that.
Yeah.
Because the prioritization, they're going to do the prioritization in a vacuum of funding. So they're going to really rank those projects, I would assume, 1 through whatever those numbers are going to be, or in groups of different tiers of some kind. That may or may not fit with the available funding, given the where we're at as a county with debt, what is appropriate for debt, and those different things. So there's still going to be some baking, if you will, to be done with that list and how it's scheduled out across years, and the types of funding that this group's going to recommend back to the Board of Commissioners and the school board.
And some of those changes may go beyond the sunset of this group. I mean, we have a finite end by legislation, and so they may go, that change may happen year over year over year, and it'll be a discussion, funding versus needs, et cetera, and so forth. But that's why I wanted to understand, because they'll prioritize, and then we have to come up with the recommendation for the multi-year plan.
Mr. Helms wants to say.
I'm sorry.
I think you're correct. We've got a charger to come back with our recommendations. I think it said by the end of June, which is not feasible because then we're past the budget process right then. So we've got to step that up a little bit. But we're to take information from both sides and come up with recommendations as a group and the community involvement to assist in an amenable solution for schools and their needs and county and their funding. And I think that's a charter. I'm going to go ahead and open up this. This 14-member board is chartered by legislation. It's my understanding that legislation is going to be stopped. And I had several conversations with Chairman Collins, and I'm asking from a commissioner standpoint that even if that stops, that we continue. I think it's great to have the opportunity to sit down together and discuss what our needs are, what our capabilities are, and we can move forward from there. So I'm looking forward to us completing this year, and frankly, I hope that we have a board for next year either, that this proves to be fruitful and we can move on.
Chairman Helms, I concur. And even if the statute is repealed, I think our responsibilities as far as needs with the Board of Education and funding with the county commissioners are clearly defined by statute. And I think this legislation was clarified to make sure there was no conflict. But yeah, even if this is repealed, I think like the last meeting, I think we're moving in the right direction. And once education gets their needs together and the county gets their funding needs together, maybe we can bring it into one package that we can all agree on and hope we can move forward with funding. But to kind of bring it back to center, as far as we're getting ready to move into pay-go, and just in case anybody isn't really familiar with it, Jeff, can you explain basically how pay-go, the reserves on hand, like the general fund balance and the capital reserve balance? So if anybody isn't clear on that, basically how you fund pay-go.
Okay, so when we say pay-go funding, what we refer to as pay-as-you-go funding or cash funding. So what Mr. Stewart was referring to is there's a couple of sources you can have for pay-as-you-go funding. Generally, what we try to do is find an ongoing source, and we'll talk about this a little bit, pros and cons. But one of the challenges the county ran into going back into its high construction days is that they became reliant on one-time sources of funding, in particular bond funding and bond savings to do their capital projects. So when the recession hit and the county's revenue started to dip, the county stopped providing ongoing pay-go funding, but allowed the schools then to really spend off of that bond savings and the leftover bond money. So when that bond money was gone, and correct me because you guys are here, but my analysis tells me that at the end of that process, there was no ongoing source of funding and there was no bond funding left. So there was not a real good source of ongoing or any funding for schools capital at that point. Now, there are a couple of options when you start talking about resources to dip into to find that cash. If you're not going to use ongoing funding, which for a maintenance program and an R&R program is really ideal, you start looking to one-time sources. One-time meaning sources that don't reoccur. You can sell assets, meaning if you have land, vacant land, which is really the largest asset that counties and schools own, you can sell that. You can sell other assets. Or you can have essentially what we refer to as retained earnings if you're on the business side of the house. The cumulative net impact of revenue over expenditures in the government. It's referred to as fund balance. And the county has multiple buckets. I didn't bring my fund accounting slides with me tonight, but I'll be happy to give a 3-hour lecture on fund accounting and local governments. But as Mr. Stewart referred to, the best way to think of it is we have multiple buckets, just like the schools have multiple buckets for federal funding, state funding, your nutrition programs, your after-school programs, and different things like that. The county has similar types of buckets. We have what we refer to as the general fund, which is the general tax dollars. We have a water and sewer fund, which is a enterprise or a business-like activity, which is funded by ratepayers. And we have our capital fund, which is no different than your capital outlay fund, where we put money in to do ongoing capital projects. Over time, those funds may grow or may shrink depending upon the revenue and expenditures of the organization. The county in the last couple of years has been very blessed, and we've seen that grow. And subsequently, we've been able to do, for instance, when we did the emergency roof program this time last year, we were able to do that out of that cumulative fund balance. The commission has set a policy level that fund balance in the general fund, which is our fund of last resort, should remain about 20% or at 20% of our expenditures. And the reason why we do that is just like in your household, to keep an emergency fund for exactly that, emergencies. If we were to have a catastrophic event in the county, we would need to call on those funds to continue operations and ensure those services. If the schools were to have a catastrophic event, the schools don't maintain a large fund balance. All that state money goes back to the state. Every year, it's zero in that fund at the end of the year. So if the schools had a catastrophic event, the general fund would be the fund everyone would look toward to cover them. So the commission, ensuring that liquidity, ensuring that backstop, if you will, for the all other county services, has made a policy of 20% keeping it. And that 20% amounts to, I believe it's about $60 million. So
I'm
anything,
sorry, somebody coughed. I didn't hear what you said.
I think it's about 60 million.
Okay, I'm
And
sorry.
I can find out exactly, it's in our monthly report, and I don't remember exactly what it was at the end of November. But what the commission then in their policy has said, if we have money above that 20%, that funding can be used for one-time things. Because again, it's like spending your savings account. So you wouldn't want to go out and buy, get a house, start paying your electric bill with your savings account, right? Because at the end of the day, your savings account, that money's gone. You're not in an ongoing funding situation. So that fund balance is then available above that 20% to be used for capital or other one-time projects, or as bridge funding to get to the next year. For instance, we've used it for some emergency purchases and those kinds of things, the roofs. The commissions put it toward capital and those kinds of things. Now, we do also have our capital fund where we've moved different sources, bonds, one-time lease revenue, those kinds of things. And the commission has appropriated through our capital fund, just like in your capital program, the money in that capital fund is appropriated or allocated to existing projects which are underway.
I have 2 questions. The 20%, is that standard operating procedure among counties? Counties our size, government, business?
The recommended, it's really twofold. The best practice is 16 to 25%. The national standard, national best practice. The LGC, which is the Local Government Commission, which is the state arm of the government, which oversees all government, towns, schools, finance in the state, and kind of dictates what we can and can't do. They have a low threshold at 8, but they also said you should not be below the mean average for your type or your size jurisdiction.
And what is our mean average?
It's about where we are, about that 20%. So it's probably 18, 19%. It changes every year. When we, Mr. Gurchak, I was just talking about S&P just a few minutes ago. What we found is when we were talking with Standard & Poor's related to our bonds, the county has over $400 million of outstanding debt. And every year that debt gets rated and reviewed by rating agencies, just like your credit score. When we talked to them in our last, what's called a surveillance, what they said was, we are concerned that your fund balance thresholds are too low. And what that translates to then is a market concern, meaning all the people that buy the bonds. Because when we sell our debt, we don't sell our debt to a bank like Bank of America. We put it out in the market. People like you and me with retirement programs go out and they buy those bonds and they put them in and they hold them and expect to get a return. When the market signals they're concerned about your liquidity position and your cash on hand, what they're signaling to the market is that they are not sure if you're going to be able to make your payments in the advent of a catastrophic event. Okay, so if you're down around 13, 14, 15%, then that triggers that concern in the market. And the resultant is that you end up with a higher cost of borrowing or an inability to borrow.
So you're saying that the 20% that the county has set ensures us a better borrowing rate or a better bond rate?
Ensures us lower borrowing costs, ensures our bond rating, also ensures that during a catastrophic event. Because the flip side of that is, if you're a business and you're a business owner and you're looking at, okay, what happens if I lose all my revenue or if I have a catastrophic event? What do I need on hand? 20% of revenue, or 20% of expenditures isn't 3 months of operations.
Yeah, no, I'm not arguing with you
Right,
now.
but I'm just
trying
telling
to
that it's-
understand where 20%.
You arrive at the 20% through kind of multiple directions because the odds of everything happening at once are fairly minimal. So what we try to do is we say, okay, if the bond market accepts 20%, and we believe 20% is sufficient for a catastrophic event to keep the county open and operating, meaning keeping sheriff's deputies out there, EMS, those things, then 20% is a reasonable number. A lot of communities in North Carolina are upwards of a 30% plus number, but not by policy, just by virtue of actuality. So we try to keep it right around 20%. So if it reaches above that 20% level, then we try to plug that back to capital, whether it's through the schools or through our capital program, because everybody has more capital needs than there is fund.
Okay, and the fund balances are currently, you said 20% is like $60 million, you said about, give or take.
Give or take.
And the fund balances are at that, they're not any higher than that.
I think we have about $1 million of flexibility. If I remember right, $1.5 million. It's somewhere in that neighborhood.
And is that total fund balance? Is that
That's the general fund.
encumbered, not?
That's just the general fund.
just the
Right.
general?
And that's unencumbered and available for
Chip.
use. Because you can't go into the water utility.
Yeah.
Well,
You can,
you can,
But.
but you
it's not
don't.
advisable.
If you need to
Right.
do- It's a, what do you call them? It's a
Enterprise fund.
Enterprise fund, thank you very much.
And there's a whole second tier bond impact because the water utilities borrowed money against those rates. So that money really belongs, those rates really belong into the bondholders. And if you start taking from that fund, you have to replenish that fund.
That will be the intergenerational.
So really just bottom line in it, what do we have fund balance wise that's not legally committed?
That's not legally committed is the 1.3 million. 1.5.
Okay.
And that would be the flexibility on the 20% that you were talking about?
Because, because I mean, the 20% is a local, we've decided, y'all have decided
But it's
20%.
still
Requirement is
policy.
8,
So the
right?
commission, it's in their budget ordinance.
Right.
So the commission would have to undo that.
No, I understand that, but that's
But then there would be bond impacts too, is what you're saying.
I
There's,
think you would have financial impacts.
Well-
Long-term, it would be detrimental because it eliminates your flexibility in the bond market. I think you drive up the borrowing costs, particularly if you're going to try to do a bond program or something.
and so do we dip into that? Like, does it get spent down to $10 million some years and then we have to rebuild it, or?
It hasn't since I've been here. I think at one time the policy was 16%. But given the concerns that S&P expressed and that we've heard from the bond markets, and our concerns just based on kind of the things that happen in different areas, the age of the building, those different things, we bumped it through the last budget ordinance to 20. So it kind of hovers right around that 20. If it goes down to 19.5, we're not going to add tax rate, for instance. We'll build back up to 20%.
Well, yeah,
right. But we can drop it. We've got a little wiggle room to drop to keep the AA rating. Now, if we're pushing for AAA, but we could go down to about 15% without jeopardizing the AA.
I would disagree. That's not what S&P said to us this last time. So, in fact, they said that we would be on negative outlook. They're coming around next time to be outlook.
And how much would the downgrade cost?
Well, it's not. It could be between 50 and 100 basis points.
I don't know what that means. Like, and
3.5 to 4. You can go from 3% to 3.5 to 4%, or 4% to 4.5 to 5%. Yeah. So it
okay.
could be over time. It could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars.
And so then what you're saying, if we're here to talk about multi-year plans, if we drop this below the 20%, then in some later year, we would have to somehow rebuild it back to whatever a good number was.
That would be the recommendation.
Okay.
You don't want, the idea is, for instance, just like in your house, you want to keep a certain amount of cash on hand for emergencies. Now, if you have to dip into that for an emergency, you want to build that back as fast as you can because you still have that exposure to these different emergencies. So there's a lot of things that can be done but aren't advisable. So when you do that and when you dip into that fund balance and it goes below a certain level, what you've done is eliminated the flexibility of the commission to address emergency needs and those things. And I think that that's the intention in trying to have a long-term plan.
Mm-hmm.
There's nothing long-term about burning down your fund balance.
Yeah, because
That's
what
it.
I'm hearing,
Instant today gratification.
if we
but in
spent
the long
10
run, Once you
million,
spend it, it's gone.
then we would have to rebuild 10 million.
It's still, yeah.
And that
Yeah.
would short us on a project later.
Right, exactly.
But Jeff, there are at times at which, like in this general fund, you have $60 million just in terms of what our function is here. Some of that money could be used in capital needs within the school system.
It
Is
is
that?
appropriate. So the amount over the 20%.
What is the amount over the 20% that's
It's
legally?
about 1.3 million, 1.5 million.
All right.
May I get clarification on that? Okay. You're talking about the 1 point something million. Is that what you guys have chosen to not encumber, or is what is legally available? Because there's a difference, and I don't know what you're talking about.
The board, through their budget ordinance, has appropriated funds, and that what is unappropriated available is the 1.5 million, 1.3, 1.5, it's in that neighborhood.
So that's not the legal, but that's what the
Right,
board
that's
has
the board
determined.
ordinance.
The board has made a law. Tell me if I'm understanding it as a regular person. The board has set a law, so we do have a law. But then what he's saying is what the market will bear for our bond rating is also around the 20%. So if we dip too much below that, we'll lose money on our debt ratio or our
If we go out and
interest.
borrow, potentially borrow more money.
which is how we pay for other things.
Right. We can talk about that.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to belabor the point. I'm trying to understand
Yeah.
as a non.
Whatever you are, Jeff.
So what you're saying is your fund balance could be, or potentially could be 75 million, but from 61.5 million up to 75, you have encumbered or set aside for something else. And so that's why you're saying that the 1.5 is, I mean, that's what I'm trying to
For
understand.
instance, okay, exactly. So let's say that fund balance is at 67 million, but the commission has appropriated money to go, for instance, this year SBCC got, I believe it was 1.5 million, 1.7 million to do a welding lab and some stuff at SBCC for the students. So while that money is not spent, that money by ordinance is appropriated. So it's no longer available. It's not encumbered, but it's allocated or assigned.
So then what is the fund balance? Encumbered, not encumbered?
All in, including all restricted assets.
Yeah.
Is going to be right around $80 million. But that includes receivables, payables, and a whole bunch of other stuff.
I'm
So-
trying to understand
Right.
the size of the box we're talking about. So it's 80, you're saying it's 80 million. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions on that? So what's available then, going back, what's available for allocation by the board is about 1.5. Okay, so Paige, go back.
Excuse me one second before you go on. So when you say 80 million, we're not talking hypothetical. We're saying that's a number you give.
So I'm saying 80 million is our fund balance. I'm not saying
Okay.
it's available.
Okay.
It's on deposit.
It's
It is on deposit.
15 million of that
It's a
is
sign.
restricted,
Okay.
and there's legal restrictions, so that includes accounts receivable we haven't received yet, that includes payables, that includes restricted, different restricted fund component revenues, grant revenues, donations, things that we're not legally allowed to spend, but show up on your balance sheet. So just like if you have a business and you show your total cash is how much you can go out and spend.
Exactly. But that's totally what you have though.
But that's what's there. But
Okay.
you have restrictions and there's calls on that
Certain.
that we can't do anything about, that are external to the organization, that are legal restrictions. So that's why when I talk about available, it gets down to, at the end of the day, all those different buckets that have been addressed, all those restrictions I've looked at, there's about $1 million and a half that could be appropriated without impacting, without hurting the staff.
Basically without the commissioners voting to make a change.
No, only the 20% part the commission can change. The rest of those restrictions are not in the commission's name.
Who's our
Those are legal
legal
restrictions,
restrictions?
either from the federal government, state government, bondholders, donations. So for instance, what's included in that $80 million are donations to the library from books. Okay, or grant money. I know you guys get multi-year grant funds, and you restrict those from year to year. Just because you have those funds doesn't mean you can spend them, but they still show up on your financial statements, but then you restrict them off. Okay, does that kind of help? So that's why we talk about it in terms of available for appropriation.
Thank you for entertaining me.
No problem. We can talk for multiple hours if you like. about your-
No, not really, but I needed to understand, so I'm good, thank you.
So going back to PAYGO. So when we talk about PAYGO, again, we're talking about ongoing sources and we're talking about one-time sources. So you can sell assets, you can the additional fund balance, if you will, those different things. There are some pros to using PAYGO funding. I think PAYGO from a market perspective and a bond rating perspective is probably one of the safest uses. So avoiding the debt markets, you don't have to go out and borrow the money. If you're using PAYGO, you don't incur that cost, you don't incur that long-term commitment. It has flexibility of uses. Remember, we talked about asset life matching a little bit. What the bond market and what the LGC will do is when you go to borrow funds, they're going to look at what you're going to buy with that money. And they're going to tell you, particularly the LGC is going to tell you whether they think you should fund using debt or they're going to deny your request to borrow for that purpose. So when you use PAYGO money, when you use PAYGO money, you don't get involved with anybody except your local folks. Okay, so that has a tremendous amount of flexibility in use. Flexibility for future funding. Just like if we take and create an ongoing funding source today for capital, and we use that capital this year, let's say it's the 19.5 million that's been appropriated this year. Well, next year, assuming tax rates all stay the same and all else being equal, there's a fresh $19.5 million available. So they can be used again. So you're not stealing that capacity from the future. And I'll show a table in a second about debt and how debt relates to PAYGO. But you're providing maximum flexibility in the future because you're not tying up your cash flow, if you will, into debt service. Okay, so that creates capacity into the future to be able to fund those projects. And then an ongoing use of PAYGO signals to the market a better financial position. Just like as if you start loading up on debt, that's going to signal to the market that you have a lower, or that you have an inability in some ways to pay for your capital needs.
Okay, yes, and I'm going back in my mind, going back through schools. I believe, if I remember correctly, the new Walter Bickett Elementary was paid for out of PAYGO money. I don't know if anybody else here. I'm pretty sure Weddington High School was done with state bond money. And I'm pretty sure that Walter Bickett, was it Dan? Okay, so a school at that point in time, an elementary school, I would guess would be $10 or $12 million. So during the ebb and flow of the economy, that's what I'm thinking about. So given the boom in the economy, that would have accounted for that much more money for you guys to just say, here, PAYGO is a whole new school. Am I thinking that right?
You can. It depends on the available cash. So if you're talking $12 million, for instance, if let's say you have the 19.5 million, if the school board decided to use 12 of the 19.5 instead of for ongoing maintenance, which I think is the bulk of what you're doing with it. Absolutely. If you were going to build a new school with it instead, you reprioritize and you said, we need this new school instead. That new school was within the 19.5. You could absolutely fund that school out of PAYGO. Okay. Or let's say that our fund balance example goes at 90 million and the 20% number 60, and there's $30 million of available funding there. The commission could absolutely say, we want to take 12 of that 30 and build a school with it. Because there's no real restriction that says to build a school, you have to go and borrow the money. It's really a decision about what's best and financially feasible when it comes to affordability and what makes sense for your current financial position.
I'm sorry, can I follow up on that? Because you were talking about the ebb and the flow of economy, and you threw something out, I'm gonna throw it out. Tax bills went out with a school tax on it. I would assume that you would think that that money would be in addition to what you have currently. And so it would raise that 60 million, that fund balance.
Yeah, the school fund that we started the county also. This is the first year. At the end of the year, the projection of that fund is about $1.8 million to apply to next year. But what that tax rate was, okay, yeah. What that tax rate represents is the PAYGO funding for capital, which is about 19.5 million, and the current expense funding of about 87 million. And that's what generates that 44-cent tax rate.
So you all decided, the commissioners have decided, or the county's decided to now tax for schools separately?
It took a portion of the existing tax rate, which was funding schools already, and we just identified the portion of the tax rate currently funding schools and split it out. So for instance, the tax rate was 66 cents. Of that 66 cents, 30 cents went to county operations, and roughly 36 cents and change went to current expense operations for the schools. So instead of keeping one tax rate to try to make it a little clearer as to where the funding goes, we put this on for all the county services in the box on the tax bill.
Yeah, I didn't see a tax bill, so that's why I'm just asking.
Well, on the tax bill, it also says how much tax goes to the sheriff's department, how much tax goes to human services, how much tax goes to general county government. So of that, the portion, the 44 cents and change, goes to the school system, which includes their capital funding and their operating funding. The 30-cent portion goes to the county operations. That's not a new tax rate. A portion of it was new, but that's
I was to
existing
say,
tax rate.
because taxes did go up.
They did. 10 cents of that 44 cents, give or take, was related to the additional, mostly the additional capital funding for the schools. Because again, going back, there was not an ongoing source for capital funds for the school. And the legislation, what the legislation required dollar-wise, the commission didn't have flexibility in other revenue sources then to raise revenue to cover that increase.
So it was directly related to the legislation, but regardless, you anticipate the fund balance because of the tax rates. You anticipate additional cash flow to help us sort out needs.
In the future, as that fund has years and starts to grow and has cumulative impact, the schools fund may start to build balance depending upon if revenue estimates come in as expected or if they come in higher or lower. And that fund is anticipated to have about $2 million at 1.7 million. And that was intentionally by design to keep the tax rate a little bit low over 2 years versus focusing on 1 year and having to jump up and then down.
Okay, and I'll just ask the second half of the question. If the legislation is repealed, will that amount go away, or we will still be able to count on that to look at future needs? So it's just the natural conclusion that I came to, so.
And Jeff and I have had conversations looking at anticipated needs, and anticipated needs are similar, is what we discussed. And I would see use for that tax rate as it is right now. However, once we get the budget and see what revenues are coming in, that'll be adjusted. I'd love to be able to lower the tax rate, but we've got to make sure we maintain the needs. I mean, I've had conversation with.
Needs are need. I mean, the needs exist whether the revenue's there or not. So, I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. So that won't, even if the legislation's repealed, we'll still be able to count on that to address ongoing needs.
We have to balance the needs with our capabilities to fund.
Mhm.
And so there's a balancing act, and that's one of the things that this board can help do to help balance that. Jeff's laid out some of the options we got. We know what our tax rate is. There's some variables in revenue. There's revaluation next year.
Yeah.
So there's several variables that can impact that.
Okay.
And so what we need to do is be good stewards, identifying what needs. I mean, needs and wants, sometimes it's very hard to differentiate.
Yeah,
And I mean, in my personal life.
People look at a need differently, and that's where the Board of Education comes in by saying, to be good stewards of the money and to say, this is what we need now, this is what we need now. We talked about leaking roofs versus building new buildings, et cetera, and so forth. And then the only point I was trying to make is that revenue stream will continue. So in order to be able to address those needs.
The short answer is it's ultimately up to the commission as to what level that revenue stream continues at.
And I can tell you that, Dr. Ellis and I have a meeting tomorrow, and we are, and also our liaisons that we have from the commission are focusing very hard to communicate, to understand what your requirements are, because we do need to address your needs. But Dr. Ellis, I'll tell you that, there may be needs that we have to put off to next year because we just don't have the funds to do it. But we can have a conversation, and as long as we communicate, and I'm committing to you that I'll do everything I can to communicate, and that's why I'd like to see this 14-member board go on, because it is a good opportunity for dialogue that we didn't necessarily have in the past.
Well, it's an opportunity for regular taxpayers to
Absolutely.
understand and be able to share that information with others who say, the schools made my taxes go up. And honestly, that's what you hear by, seeing that line. So
I just want to interject. I don't think we need to get caught up in next year's funding. We are charged, at least in my opinion, we've got to figure it out an ongoing, long-term
That's right.
funding solution for Union County Public Schools. And I think right now, we're spending a lot of time talking about next year. We need to be talking about 20 years down the road. For the different, we'll figure out, but I think we've got to figure out a way that we address the ongoing needs of youth county.
Well, yeah, I'm
We can
just
figure out the
saying
numbers
that
after
the taxes are part of it, and that's why I was asking about that.
And I agree.
That's separate.
I agree, but I think we've
Right,
got a lot
that's
of
all.
time talking
Just my
about what fund
clarification.
balance is. Let's talk about how we're going to fund stuff in the future.
Jeff, one question, and like I say, this is for the benefit of those that hadn't seen this unfold 1,000 times in minutia. But as far as the split that you're referring to is percentage of school tax versus other service tax, that's strictly ad valorem, right? Is that breakdown? The entire pool is what, around 355 million? You back 50, 60 million or so from enterprise. So there's some other streams of revenue. So, and I think he gets to that later. But, and I mean, some people get hung up on the ad valorem aspect of it, but there's other sources that we can look at as far as long-term funding is concerned. And my question to you is, I think you guys wrestled with the pay-go option as far as a health and human service bill. And I think that was part of the debate you guys had on whether to use debt service or pay-go. So that's not really an alien concept, kind of like the water bick at elementary school. That is an option if we have the reserves to do it, right?
Right, and I think that comes down to then going back to organizational risk and where the organizations are comfortable taking fund balances down to. And I think the commission is taking the position that 20% is kind of that watermark that we're willing to take, that they're willing to take the county's finances down to. So absolutely, pay-go funding. In fact, I encourage pay-go funding, particularly for the types of projects that the schools have. They're really more tailor-made for pay-go funding than they are for debt funding. And I'll get to that a little bit when I start talking about debt. And I absolutely will address that question because I think that's a very good question of why ad valorem versus other revenue sources.
Did somebody get you water?
They did.
You're going to be up here for a while, obviously. Courtesy of me, I guess.
Okay, so some of the downsides of using pay-as-you-go funding. We talked a little bit about generational inequity, meaning if you use all the cash from today, that's from today's taxpayers, if you will. So all the people that benefit from it in the future are going to miss out necessarily or won't have to pay their fair share. Foregone investment earnings, which if you're in the investment markets, you know, really are not anything these days. I think we're only 10 basis points on a portfolio. So in a higher yield environment, foregone interest earnings are an important thing, not really right now. Facilitates poor planning. And let me explain why that's on there, because I think it's important to note when you use pay-go funding, all the good things about it that make it flexible and make it easy to maneuver and move around are the same things that keep you from walking into a long-term plan and ensuring those things in your plan get done, not just the things that kind of pop up as leadership changes, as board changes, and boards change, whether we like it or not, they do. So when we talk about pay-go funding, that's so flexible that it can be changed over time. Okay, unlike debt, when you lock debt in and you borrow debt, you're really locking into your long-term plan. So when I say it facilitates poor planning, what I mean is the flexibility puts you in a position where you may or may not get the most important things done if there are changes or necessary changes in the future. And then reduces liquidity. And everyone understands when we talk about liquidity, what we're talking about is the county's ability to pay its daily bills. So as you spend out pay-go funding, depending upon the source, you could reduce your ability to make payments, debt payments, things like that. So it's a very fancy way to say less money you pay.
Well, and this group is saying something about, you know, a certain percentage of pay-go should be set aside for your multi-year plan versus debt versus whatever, and then those buckets or dishes could get rearranged depending upon priority. True?
I think that's a very good point. If I can have this conversation a couple weeks ago now. When you're dealing with pay-go funding particularly, I would always encourage funding for needs you don't know are going to happen. For instance, boilers go out, right?
That's correct. We refer to it as preventative maintenance.
Preventative maintenance, things that you may not have on your schedule, but you know are going to happen consistently over time. ACs go out, things happen, buses, different things. So keeping a certain part of your capital program available as a bucket identified for things for emerging needs, if you will, for preventative maintenance items is important. And that allows you flexibility to pay good funding. You can have that bucket, if you will, of funding available to address those needs.
I'm sorry, I'm going to drive Mr. Akins crazy tonight, but that's okay. You were talking about your fund balances for your stuff.
Your fund balance is really for your operational.
So it's not emergency.
It's not necessarily for emergency capital. It can be, depending upon if you reach the point where you have to, but what I'm suggesting is you plan a little bit more for your emergency capital because you know something's going to happen. You're not sure how much it's going to amount to, but you know maybe 10% of your total capital program. You need to set that aside because you know any given year I'm going to have 15 things go wrong and it's going to amount to 10%. It's not going to be the same 15 things every year, but I'm going to have 15 things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
When I'm talking about fund balance, I'm talking about a hurricane comes through, takes the, an ice storm comes through, and we have to move everybody out, and we have to have 24-hour shifts for the sheriff's deputies, or something to that effect, some catastrophic event. Okay. Not ideal. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. So debt financing. Okay, so debt is essentially just like in your home. You borrow to buy cars, you borrow to buy a house. Businesses all the time build facilities. Governments borrow money through the debt markets to build things or to purchase things. Okay, and in North Carolina, you really have three major tools, but there are different types of tools out there. GO bonds. You hear a lot of times we talk about bond elections, general obligation bonds, meaning those are general obligations of the government backed by the debt or backed by the tax. So when we go out and we sell those bonds, they're typically, until the last few years, were considered gold-plated, the highest form of security you can get, because what you're doing is actually pledging to the bondholder who buys that debt, that $400 million of debt we have outstanding, that if the county doesn't raise its tax rate high enough to cover that debt service, then the bondholder actually has the right to compel you to raise your tax rate. And in fact, in North Carolina, what will happen is the LGC will take control of your local government finance operations and will raise your tax rate for you to cover those GO bonds. So those are the best gold-plated debt instruments counties have. And that's reflected then in the bond pricing. So we were talking about that 100-point spread earlier. Well, the other way, besides ratings, higher credit scores, are the types of debt. So a GO bond will price lower, that 3% range, versus a revenue bond, which is not as secure. Okay. We also use limited obligation bonds, which are kind of the newest thing, or not the newest thing, but more recently in vogue in North Carolina. Limited obligation bond essentially means that the commission says we're going to every year appropriate funding to pay that debt payment. It's not as strong as a GO pledge because you haven't given the bondholder the right to come in and raise your tax rates, but you said we promise to pay. It's more promise to pay. Revenue bonds, you secured that debt with the revenue pledge, just like we were talking about the water and sewer fund. What we've done is we've borrowed revenue bonds and said, okay, market, we're going to pledge the revenue from our water system to pay that debt back. I haven't seen it necessarily done in North Carolina as much, but a lot of states, what you see is sales tax revenue bonds, where the county or the city will pledge sales tax revenue to cover debt. Okay. We don't use them really anymore. We have used them here in the county with certificates of participation, which basically then use the asset, the school, if you will, to secure the debt. So just like your house you're living in, your house secures your mortgage, and you don't pay that mortgage, then the bank can do what? They can foreclose, sell your house. Well, we have several schools, I think, still in our system that are securing debt so that if the county didn't make the debt payment, I doubt any bondholders really want a school. But in theory, that school can go to the auction block and be used to relieve that debt. Like I said, those were really popular in the 2000s and toward the end of the 2000s. They're not really done anymore because it's just not a real popular thing to pledge a school. You see them a lot of times with stadiums and that kind of stuff. Capital leases, basically, that would take any number of different types of lease structures, build to suit, lease back, where at the end of the process, you maybe own the asset. For instance, somebody builds you a building and you make those payments over 20 years, and in your agreement at the end of that 20-year period, then they turn title of that building over to you for some nominal purchase price or no purchase price. And then there's, beyond these kind of top 5, there's a whole waterfront of instruments that you can use. Mr. Yurchek, I know you're in the markets. They can take all kinds of different things, pretty much whatever you can get someone at a bank to accept or someone in the market to accept, and you're willing to pay the interest rate on that type of debt. You can create a debt instrument to kind of match that. So some of the pros and cons.
Jeff, can I ask one question? Like say, and I know some of us have heard this before, but bonds that we're about to retire that are down at a low level, isn't there a threshold that you can reissue part of that debt and general obligation bond to fill some financing needs?
What you're referring to are called 2/3 bonds. Okay, so the way that the LGC and general statutes work is that as you pay off those general obligation bonds, you're allowed to issue, and that's voter approved debt, you're allowed to issue 2/3 of the principal that you paid off in that year. So let's say this year we retire $20 million. We can go out and borrow 2/3 of the $20 million. Now the trick is, in scheduling this out, is next year it's 2/3 less whatever we borrowed this year. So it's this cascade effect to eventually get to nothing. But if you borrow, there's all kinds of tricks to when you borrow and you don't. But what you're referring to is you can take existing GO bond authority and reborrow it at the 2/3 level and still use that same tax pledge. Okay.
Jeff, one kind of tying back into what Frank was saying a minute ago, just looking down the road, if we're going to use some bonds for down the road, how much can we borrow right now without affecting our bond rating? And what is our bond rating, just so everybody knows?
We are a AA plus. We're a AA plus, depends on which, we have a split rating. So we price off the lowest at AA. Capacity to borrow is a number of factors. So when you start talking about how much can we borrow, it's what's your legal debt limits as far as what capacity we have in GO bonds or other tools. So we were just talking about limited obligation bonds, particularly in this case, or other types of revenue bonds. Then it becomes a calculation of affordability, because although we're paying off every year, we're not drawing down that debt service by half every year. We're drawing it down by 1 or 2 million. So if you were to take $1 million, for instance, it's about, let's see, it'd be right around $10 to $12 million would be the capacity $1 million payment would make on a 20-year note at about 5%. So you could, if you were to remonetize that, remonetize the paid off debt or the relieved debt service. And what we really tried to do then, and what happened, let me go back. What the county did as it was borrowing originally, instead of raising the rates over time to cover that debt service, the county cut back county side services to make that. So as demand and everything else was growing, and the county was growing, the rates which the voters had approved to pay that bond indebtedness never came on the books. They kept the tax rates level, or in some cases reduced them.
Right. School board signs over the lottery money.
Right. And that helps pay for the debt.
Right.
So in getting to the 19.5 million, and where that calculation came from that was in the legislation, is we went back and did an analysis and said, okay, since 2002 to 2003 timeframe, if we had issued all the debt the voters have approved, what should the tax rate have been to cover that debt service? To make it, all things being equal, if we carried out what the voters had approved at some point, then what would that number be? It was 8.2 cents. 8.2 cents then in tax rate translates to $19.5 million. So in lieu of giving that money in debt service, what happened this year is that money became pay-as-you-go funding for capital. And based on, as the Commissioner mentioned, based on what happens in the future of the tax rate, could be there. But the suggestion and the reason why we recommended the 8.2 cents is because it really reflected what the voters had approved as a tax rate to cover the debt service that was outstanding. So that became pay as you go. And essentially, when we kept the debt service on the county side of the equation, not in the schools fund, the county essentially ate that debt service with the exception of the sales tax.
Okay.
Okay, does that
So-
make sense?
Yeah, but so just to kind of boil it back down though, if, as we put all this together, how much without jeopardizing our bond rating can we go out and borrow again for what this group is tasked with doing? We're supposed to come up with the funding plan for the BOE for, for a period of time to take care of what our ongoing needs are going to be. So our debt rating is very important because it ties into what we pay for the money. We go get the money, we got to pay for it. Just like you do when you borrow your house or borrow with your house. So where are we there? I mean, kind of what, in your opinion, is that number that doesn't jeopardize our AA+ rating?
Let me add to that. How much can we borrow to keep our payments the same as they are now?
It's going to be in that. It's going to be in that.
And you know that doesn't work.
range. But if you go out and do a bond election, which would be probably the preferred tool for doing the schools, then the market will accept the GO pledge
Right.
with the tax rate. And that is about the best rate you're going to get. And if you have a bond election and it's approved by the voters and you have a pledge from the commission, then to also back that debt with tax, then you can borrow to the level that the commission's willing to borrow to some degree.
Okay.
I mean, obviously you can't go out and borrow another.
Well, I think
$1 billion.
Yadkin Valley was just stepping up there to loan us money.
But that's what I'm saying. So really it amounts to what you're going to spend it on. I'll see.
I can guarantee it.
Robert and I are.
So that number is, I don't think I heard the answer to the question, is how much do you think we can borrow?
I have a question.
I think it's dependent upon a couple of things, because it depends on what the voters are going to approve as far as their tax rates being impacted by the new debt.
I mean, I think that's the question. I mean, bond ratings have many inputs to determine what the bond rating is. And so, I mean, that's one question, but the revenue side of it goes into the factor of what the bond rating would be. So we could triple our tax load on the individuals in the county and be able to go out and borrow a whole lot more. The question is that in the best interest for growing the county and doing it for?
To Randy's point, how much can we borrow and not significantly impact the taxpayer?
And what I'm telling you right now, the best you're probably going to do is a little bit, you're going to pay off each year of the capacity created in that 19.5 million. If you didn't want to take that capacity and push it to pay as you go funding. So really, what has to be determined once you determine what the needs are is when you set that bond package aside, then you determine how much do we have in this bond election, and then you go to the voters, because it really becomes then what the voters will accept. You can triple the tax rate, but your voters may not accept that. So it becomes a balancing act between the available funding, the ability of the taxpayer to pay, the ability of the schools to spend, and then the impact of that. And so there's no real cut answer to how much is available, how much can you spend, because it just depends on a whole lot of different factors.
But that 1920 a year is a comfortable number.
That 19 or 20 a year right now is mega. So if you start cutting that down, and let's say you take 10 million of that and you monetize it to debt, and you make it 110 million in debt, that 10 million now is out the door every year for debt service for the next 20 years. Mike's ability now to do ongoing projects is 10 million, not 20 million.
And that's where I was going with that, because, you could issue the bonds, but you still have the debt service to cover the bonds, and that debt service is going to come out of the pay-go side of the equation. So
As far as bonds and rates or tax rates are concerned, and I know there are two gentlemen sitting at the desk tonight that had to feel the pain of the mismanagement of debt in the past. But one thing I'd really like for this group to emphasize, as far as funding is concerned, if we look at general obligation bonds, we need to make sure that the revenue is provided to service those bonds, because these two guys got stuck with a very unpleasant tax increase once the chickens came home to roost, if you will, for the deferred maintenance costs. But I think it's very important for this group to make clear that if we're going to obligate ourselves, let's service that debt. Let's not get to a position like we did the last time. That's Kevin, the taxpayer, talking. Let's not put the gun to our head and hope the economy keeps rolling.
I was gonna say, you make it very clear to the voters what they're voting on, and then you implement the tax that goes along with it.
Well, just to be clear, we can only do bond requests in certain years, right?
You can hold a bond election in even number of years during your general election. So your next one's going to be May 2016, November 2016.
All right, I want,
May of 20.
They changed the law.
When did that change?
The law changed back in 14 so that we do our primary, we do an election the first Tuesday after the South Carolina primary. So for us, it's March the 1st.
South Carolina primary is February 27, and the first Tuesday after that would be March 1st. And if we didn't do it then, we would have to go to the November because it would have to be a general election.
Okay, you're talking presidential primaries.
So are you
Yeah.
talking about 2016?
So 2016 and 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would be the March. I'm sorry.
March
You are.
2016.
It's just, it's a convoluted,
But typically.
we got to wait on South Carolina.
Typically every other year, it's going to be that May deadline because it's going to be the general election in which the entire county runs. You can't do it through a special election any longer. Either way, it's an even number of years.
It's got to be that all the polling precincts are open without having a special event or doing something special. It has to just naturally occur that all the polling places are open, then you can do it.
Okay, so we could not do this every year even if we wanted
No.
to.
I think our task here is, and I think we have to be careful, we can be on a slippery slope. I can tell my children, you've got $100 million to spend. And
adopt
they'll
me.
spend every penny of it. However, I think our task is to identify our needs and then determine what type of funding, how we could fund the needs and the timeframes that and I think that's our task.
Find a way to fund them, yeah.
I think it's a slippery slope to try to say, there's $100 million out there, let's go spend it. And I don't think that's our task.
No, but I think our task is to understand what sources there are so we can make the best decision for the county and for the schools to use all of those sources, I guess is just my point.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like I need to understand the big picture to understand what I can do to
You all are stuck with community members, sorry.
Yeah,
It's a lot of
sorry.
questions.
That's
It's
the
just way
purpose of it.
is.
And what we do, and my board knows because we've sat and done it, is we throw it up on the wall and we model it. And so we say, okay, for every incremental increase in debt of X, ultimately at the end of the day, this is what the taxpayer sees come out the bottom. So that you can have an understanding that affordability factor and an understanding of where the money comes from to pay that debt and its impact on the average homeowner. Because I think that's really what we're talking about is the schools, the community will only accept what the community can afford to a certain degree. And the bond market is aware of where that is. So you're limiting your debt capacity to what the community can afford. And that's determining that it's kind of this push up, push down, and try to figure out exactly what that is. So the debt financing, just like we kind of had PAYGO, we have pros and cons. When you use debt for those larger things you can use it for, you really do achieve that generational equity. Because the users of that debt pay for that every year, and those users of that facility. So if I have a child, and we build a school with debt, and I put my kid in that school, and they go through for 12 years, and I pay 12 years of that 20 years of debt service, I've paid my fair share over that 20 years for that facility. Does that kind of make sense for everybody? Just like in a water line, if I'm a 20-year water customer, and I pay that rate for 20 years, I pay for my portional share of that increased water capacity. Increases your short-run project capacity. So where, for instance, we may not be able to afford a $50 million PAYGO high school, we can go out and borrow $50 million, and now you have $50 million to do the project. On the backside, you have to pay that, but it gives you enough project funds at the start of the process to be able to do your project. Provides annual cost assurance. The one thing with PAYGO is it can go up and down based on the elected officials at the time and based on other factors. Okay, so every year commissioners will have to make a decision on what that PAYGO funding is. They can't buy in that future commission when it comes to ongoing pay-as-you-go financing. However, when you use debt, that debt binds future commissions to make that payment. So you do have cost assurance. So we know We sit down and we look, just like you can look at your mortgage, you know what that's going to be over the next 20, 25 years. It protects against inflation because nothing is as cheap as it's going to be today in the future. So if you're building a major project and you build it today, you're not putting it off, then you'll save on inflation. If CPI is 3, 4, 5%, then you see that project cost, and the further you push it out in the future, that project cost consequently goes up. Okay. Some of the cons is it may require voter approval. And the reason that's a con is not because you don't want the voters to approve it, it's because of the timing issue. You go back to, you're limited to an even number of years. If you don't hit this next 16 year with a bond election, your next opportunity to do that election is in 18. And the need will change, or the need may not have been met then for going on 3 to 4 years. Long-term operational impact of debt service. Just as mentioned earlier, when you borrow money, that payment comes due every year. Reduced flexibility. When you bond fund things, you can only spend bond funds on certain items. You can't use it for anything the commission or the board approves. Limited application, same thing. Decreases the long-term project capacity. Again, you get all that money up front, but in the long run, what you've done is you've reduced your ability to fund projects because you've built up debt service and you're paying interest on that debt service. So here's a real quick example. I apologize for everybody if that's a little too hard to see. I know you can see that in the slides. If you take two project funds and your goal is to get $1 billion for that project fund in debt, you're going to end up after 20 years paying almost $1.7 million for that $1 million project fund. Okay. Now the benefit is you get $1 million in 2016. But if you're going to use PAYGO funding at $80,000 annually, you will end up being able to apply all 1.7 million of that funding to projects. Okay. So essentially, you're adding to your cost. And so you're checking if you're doing the calculation. It's not a perfect calculation. It's fine. So it's a rule of thumb. It's,
I got numbers here in a minute.
If you want to back into that interest rate, you're welcome to. But what you do is, if you get $1 million today, you ultimately cost yourself $1.7 million by the end of the year. And that's the point. Is if you want to get $1 million in debt, it's going to cost you $1.7 million in capacity over 20 years. Now, if you want to get $1.7 million over 20 years, the way to go is to use $80,000. Okay. This is always an interesting illustration. And this is like a truth in lending statement. When you close on your house, and you always flip that back page, and you're like, "Oh, I'm paying that for my house." Well, that's kind of this. This is what that approximates. Again, I use round numbers. $1 million. We wouldn't go to the market for $1 million. It would cost us. So funding examples. So really, again, gave you two primary things you could do. Additions to existing buildings. I could argue you could PAYGO fund that, or depending upon the size of the addition, I think it would be appropriate for debt funding. If you're adding a wing to a school and that school is going to add capacity to that school, then it makes sense to use debt funding. If you're not going to really add capacity and it's a storage room, I'd probably go with PAYGO option. So it depends. IT equipment, I wouldn't use debt funding for IT equipment. I would use PAYGO because the lifespan of that IT equipment is not going to last as long as your debt or as long as your obligation to pay for it. Okay?
Jeff,
Yes, ma'am.
when we build new schools, the
Okay, so what Dr. Nelson is referring to is when you build a school, in theory, what you need to open the school on day one is all entirely appropriate to bond. Okay, what I'm referring to is additions or replacements. Okay, so it's a de minimis cost in the grand scheme of the larger project, and it's not the project. The preponderance of the project is the construction. So it's really not, it's okay to do it. Just like when you finance your house, you pay for doorknobs and you pay for, a lot of times you'll pay for a washer dryer, or you'll pay for the dishwasher, the garbage disposal, all those things. You're not really taking out 20-year note to pay for a garbage disposal. You're taking out 20-year note to pay for a house. The garbage disposal just happens to be part of this.
Yeah.
Okay. So in this case, the other way to look at it is, some have said if you take a school and you turn it upside down, whatever falls out shouldn't be bond funded. It should be PAYGO. That's an opinion.
Well, and I mean, all of this is really just kind of preference. I mean, it's not that we're legally obligated to not use debt to pay for some of this. This is just,
This is going to be, the LGC is going to not let you issue debt for some of these things.
depending on the costs of, because I mean, I can take you through an ADA restroom scenario where we were going to go through and do $250,000 worth of ADA across the school system, not just one school, but if we were going to go update all the ADA restrooms, that project's $250,000, or where it's going to be $1 million, we could use debt in that instance. So if it's going to be a $25,000 ADA upfit, we're not going to use debt for that. But
Right, and that gets back to the materiality of it. If you're going to do a full-size restrooms program, for instance, and say do all of your restrooms again up to ADA, it's going to be a $5-10 million program, and that's going to be that ADA renovation is going to last you 20 years. Then we would have to try to pitch that, and I hate to say pitch, we would try to convince the LGC that that's going to work. The LGC, depending upon their opinion, may or may not approve that. But if you look at it on microcosm, literally, if you're doing one bathroom or 2 bathrooms in the school or 3 bathrooms in the school, and the sum total of that project is $65,000, they're not going to allow you to use debt to do that. Okay. Keep it in mind, all the debt we issue, the LGC has to sign off on what we're doing with it, and you have to do what you said you're going to do with it. So security improvements, talking about host interface devices, cameras, those kinds of things, probably not something I would debt finance, but something you should use pay as you go for. Because again, lifespan. Okay. Full building renovation, meaning take it all the way down to the studs, to the metal framing, and rebuild it. I think that that's an appropriate debt financing project. I think the LGC would agree and we'd be able to get authorization for that. I wouldn't go with PAYGO because you get back to that generational equity. Essentially, you built that school's capacity now for another 30 or 40 years to go forward. So that's probably a more appropriate debt funding. And then replacement bleachers, not a full stadium, but a replacement bleacher, for instance, the kind of slide out or whatever. Those lifespans may not be appropriate for debt, but are more appropriate for pay as you go. And we could do, there's 10,000 of these types of things, and a lot depend on the scenario and those kinds of things. I kind of want to give you a general idea, one way or the other. I'm going to get a question.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know that we'll do full building renovations, but I mean, you would build a new school as opposed to doing that. But what about partial, this wing needs a new roof and new siding and.
I would say if what you're doing is going to add significant lifespan to the facility. Okay, so let's say we take a wing and you're going to completely take it down and redo it and put it back, and that's going to add 20, 25 years, 30 years of life to that school, then I would say it's probably appropriate for debt.
Okay.
But if what you're doing
It's
doesn't
just gonna
really expand
get you
the life,
through into the next school year or the school year after that.
yeah, that's not going to be appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
Is that kind of,
Yeah, it makes sense.
and it really does. And I wish I could say it's more scientific than this, but it really is walking through case by case scenario and analyzing each project and determining.
Makes sense.
And if we think it's appropriate for the market, then we go out and do it. Okay, is that kind of, it's an imperfect answer, I know, but
It's okay, good answer.
it's the answer. So developing the funding plan. So now we kind of understand our tools. So how would you proceed? So Mike's group right now working on identifying the needed projects. The board will eventually prioritize those projects. Then we'll take all that big bucket of projects and determine which sources and types of funding are appropriate for each of those projects. Okay. Then we'll establish the capacity of each of the funding sources, meaning how much PAYGO funding should be recommended, how much debt funding, if any, should be recommended. Then we establish maybe if we're going to do a bond election, when that'll be. And then you schedule projects then and slate those into this long-term plan in accordance with that prioritization and capacity. Okay, so the fundamental questions: what are you going to spend it on? What are you going to spend it? And how much do you need? Right. So that's kind of the discussion. If you answer those 3 questions, we can always tell you what the funding plan should look like. Okay. So the question came up. We were asked to kind of talk a little bit about where, generally where the dollars come from and tax dollars. This is all current revenue and operating revenues. This doesn't include any fund balances. This is just dollars we bring in on an annual basis. I think Dr. Ellis, your name tag's hiding the total at the bottom.
Your nameplate.
Your little tempt.
There you go. So it's 355.8, almost 0.9 million. As you can see on this, this is all the total funds of the county. So this includes the enterprise funds, volunteer fire departments, all the different funds the county has. You have, I think you guys have like 6 or 7 funds. We have somewhere in like 30 funds. You can see the preponderance of the largest chunk of what we get, about 53%, is ad valorem taxes. And the question came up, how did we arrive at using ad valorem taxes and designate property tax for schools versus the other sources? Because as you can see, we have ad valorem, we have sales taxes, there's other taxes, intergovernmental revenue, charges for service, enterprise charges, investment income, and internal service charges about 7.5%, transfers, a little bit of usage of fund balance. So if we have all these other sources, how do we settle on that? When you start to take apart and look at these different components, the intergovernmental revenues, for instance, are not available to be spent on general county operations. Intergovernmental revenues for the county generally represent the money we receive from the federal government and the state government to provide social services and health department assistance. So the bulk of that money, all but about 82,000 of it, is restricted to provide services, kind of just like your federal funding, your state funding, provide those direct services to clients. That money is restricted to provide services to those clients. Social services, health department, adoptions, all those different programs, which as an agent of the state through our human services department, we provide. So that takes that 9% out of the equation automatically. The 10 point, almost a little over 10.5% of enterprise charges, that really represents our water fund. So that's the revenue brought in and the cost associated with providing water. So the water customer, you turn on your faucet, you use the water, you write a check to the county. So 10% of our total revenue is that check coming in from the ratepayer. So that money is not really available, not available for general government. That money pays for the water fund and provide that service. If we took that money, we wouldn't be able to provide water. So hence the enterprise concept. Non-enterprise charges for service. These are charges for things such as library fines, classes, Cane Creek. When you go down to Cane Creek and you pay into the park, and what that money then does, it's about 3.4% here, and that's really only a small portion of it. That money then gets put back into the park to provide lifeguards, to provide concessions, to provide kayaks and maintenance on the park, paving, all those different things. And that does not begin to cover the cost of those types of programs. So Parks and Recreation, and that ranges from everything from Parks and Recreation to the Ag Center, to any number of, anything you pay a fee for in the county to use, that's where that money goes, is into that bucket. So we've covered intergovernmental revenue, non-enterprise, enterprise service charges, investment income. This money goes with whatever fund earns it. So, for instance, the water fund, if the water fund has a balance and it gets investment earnings, those investment earnings necessarily stay with the money that earned those investments. So the ratepayer, if you will, is invested in the water system, they get the benefit of their investment income. And ultimately what it does is allows us to keep certain rates low and so forth. Internal service charges, those are essentially chargebacks between departments. We charge for IT services from one department to the next. So this is a gross, what we call a gross look. Those funds pay for services used by other funds. So the general fund uses IT services, the water fund uses IT services. Instead of everyone having their own IT department, we have a centralized IT operation, and those funds are then charged for that service. And it goes right out, essentially pays exactly, it's a dollar for dollar payment for what it costs to provide those services to those funds. And then in turn, for instance, in the water fund, the internal service charge is billed back to the ratepayer. Okay. Sales tax. So really, when you kind of get through all of this.
Did you talk about other revenue?
That's okay.
Oh,
okay. So
I'm sorry.
you kind of get through these other transfers are very small parts, so that's moving money between the funds. Other taxes, a very small part, but that represents the one-off small tax. You want to provide that to you. But it's a bunch of little things, and those generally have been our general tax dollars. Then local option sales taxes, these are probably between ad valorem and sales tax, that's the goal of the revenue you take on the utility. And there's a large portion of that is dedicated by the statute. The lottery or the other statutes and laws that require that money to be spent on education. A long time ago, that money was determined and was used to add. So all of the sales tax the county takes in, 8.7% of that equates to be right around 40 something. 30, just over 30, just under 31 million. All of that funding covers the debt for schools. So the total debt the county pays for schools is about $43 million. The portion of it that comes from sales tax, we at this point have allocated almost 31 million of the sales tax. So none of that sales tax by allocation goes anywhere else but that debt service. Okay, so once then.
I'm sorry. So you said your local option sales tax is about 40 million?
I've had it wrong. I'm sorry. It's 30. It's a little over 30 million.
Oh, okay.
I was thinking the debt related to it is about 40, 41, 42 million.
Okay.
So it's in that neighborhood. But because that debt service outweighs the cost or the sales tax revenue, all of that sales tax is allocated to the debt. By law, a portion of it, I think it's 40% of one, 60% of the other, is allocated already. But what we do is we go ahead and allocate the remainder to the debt. And then what's left, because now you've taken this whole slice out of the pie, you're left with the ad valorem taxes. And in truth, the commission can't raise any of those other resources. The commission can't go out and raise sales tax. We're capped. We're limited in our ability to do that.
Okay.
So
Go ahead and finish that and I have a question.
So the only flexible revenue, if you will, or the only flexible tool then that the commission has to increase funding for whatever reason, to increase funding for capital, to increase funding for operations, then becomes the ad valorem rate. Okay, so the fundamental question that comes back to the original question Mr. Stewart asked, why ad valorem rate? Well, if you take a look at all these other options, there aren't really any other sources that the commission can go to fund current expense and ongoing capital needs. So it's appropriate, because all the sales tax is already allocated, to use that one singular source they have and have the flexibility to change to fund schools in this case, or any other service. So if the sheriff, for instance, we needed to add significant funding in the sheriff's department, they'd be in the same boat. The sheriff's allocation of the tax rate would go up. And again, that table's on your tax bill, and we can absolutely see it.
Yeah. Jeff, we talked some about this, I think, earlier, but I keep coming back to the same question in my mind. Is this all the pie? Are there other pieces to the pie? Now, Amy, when you and I had lunch this week, one question we have is, with any organization, there are funds that can be moved around. And whether it's at church or whether it's in a business or whatever. So what other pieces of pie can we use?
This is the ongoing pie. So this is the pie. Every year, our operating budget is going to be around, depending upon the changes, that $350 million number. Okay, so this is ongoing revenue. You see all these sources up here, with the exception of down in the little corner fund balance, are ongoing in nature.
But it's not the whole pie because it's not showing the fund balances in each of the.
Right. This only shows fund balance to the extent the commission used it this year.
They're assigned. They're encumbered.
So
They're
this is just
encumbered.
the budgeted pie. This is not the real pie.
Several pies.
So is this the 20% that we talked about? That's not in this chart.
That would not be in here because that's not an ongoing.
So this is just what you budgeted for. So whatever this 53.32% in ad valorem taxes represents dollar-wise, that's what you budgeted for. If you raise 10 million more than that, or 200,000 more than that, or whatever the case is, then what happens to that money? And is that something that we can consider? Is there a true-up process and something
Let's
we
play that
can
out.
consider?
Because that's a good question. Let's play that out for a second.
Okay.
So we estimate, let's say we estimate it's about $190 million of ad valorem taxes. Let's say we bring in 200 million, right? What ends up happening then, that $10 million will go into the fund balance that we talked about earlier. The commission then, when it comes to budget time next year, and we have that 10 million, we completed our audit process, we've done all the restrictions, made sure it's legit against all the other restrictions we have in the county. If, let's say that fund balance, that 10 million then is above the 20% mark based on the policy. Then the commission, you see that little fund balance, that 3.7% down there, the commission can then choose to appropriate that because it's above their policy, and they can appropriate it with certain conditions under their policy, so one-time things. For instance, when we did the roofs, there was $9 million in fund balance above the policy level available. So they used that 9 million, and when they took that 9 million out of fund balance and then put it into the budget, so they drew it from their savings, moved it into their checking to use, it became available for use. And that number, if you're talking general fund, is about 1.3 million at this point. We can't project out to determine what that number is going to be. We'll know when we finish our audit next year what that number will be next year.
Do I recall something that you're only allowed to budget for a certain amount in relation to last year or something like that? It's 98% or?
We are required by general statute to budget the maximum of last year's collections.
Okay.
So let's say we bill $100 million.
Yeah.
And we collect, the previous year was like 98 million. The next year, if we have a billing of 100 million, by general statute, we are only able to budget 98 million. So we're limited by the general statute as to what we're allowed to budget that for. That's why a lot of times you'll see just a little bit more, maybe $1 million more, maybe $1.2 million more on the ad valorem side, because we have a really aggressive collections department and they try to do the best they can.
So in being in a kind of growth mode, which I think we'll all agree that we are, that you would hope that this number, we see this ad valorem number continue to go up, not through tax raises, but through new residents coming here, which in turn may send their children to schools or use county services or whatever. But so you expect, we can expect this number to grow in some fashion.
Well, this year it's all complicated. I know it's kind of hard to get late. I don't want to get into it too much, but we also have a reval going on right now.
Yeah.
So,
I get that.
based on what my conversation.
You don't know what.
We're going the other way. So, we've actually seen the value decline since 2008 because our last valuation was, we had that high peak. But in theory, all else being equal, every year then, once you complete and close your books, which is about October for us, then whatever amount over that 20% of fund balance policy level and those other restrictions is available and appropriable can be used for one-time things. You all want to go, like I said, you don't want to go out and do something that costs you ongoing because you're
For
just
one-time things.
next year. But it's available. And this year, having done our audit now, we know that number is in that $1 to $1.5 million range.
Jeff, because I'm still back excited about that maybe additional $10 million. that you were talking.
Don't get too excited.
I'm like, I know it was just an example, but take 19.7 is this year. Would that be, would it come to 29.7 possibly? For the count? We've got the 19.7 that we're going to be receiving this year, right?
Talking about the pay-go funding, the 19.5 million.
From the statute.
I guess your example, Jeff, would be, your example was if you had a surplus of 10 million, would that supplant the 19.7?
No,
or would it be in addition?
It'd be in addition to.
Okay, that's a good question because as Mr. Sir pointed out, we arrived at ad valorem and allocating ad valorem tax and setting it aside, and this comes back to your true-up question, is we count for that separately now. So the tax rate that was shown on your tax bill for schools, if that tax rate yields higher than estimated revenue, okay, then that revenue then becomes part of the available resources for future use. Now, the commission intentionally
For the school system.
Right, so the commission intentionally this last year set that rate over a 2-year period to keep us from having a rate that kind of had a peak and a valley. So it was a kind of medium rate, if you will. So in theory, we budgeted to have like 1.7 million of fund balance in the operating funds for schools. But let's say we go out and we collect 99.5%, not 98. That 1.5% then will become available in addition to the 19.5 million or the 87 million, because it really is coming from the same, at this point, coming from the same pot. So
it wouldn't go to water and sewer, for an example.
no,
It's definitely allocated to
right now it's
UCP capital
allocated,
needs.
separately accounted for, and you can see it in our monthly reports. It's in our financial statements and stuff.
Okay.
Absolutely.
That's great.
I think it's a little disingenuous to put it on the tax bill. Say, here's your school's tax rate.
Well, yeah.
And then play hide and seek with it.
Yeah.
So,
Jeff, it's been said you eat a whale one bite at a time, and this is a pretty big fish we're eating here tonight, but I'm chewing steadily. But something that I've wondered about prior to tonight as well, and since I've got you, I want to ask you about this, like intergovernment revenue, that is your human services and federally restricted. And then I noticed, the revenue is 32 million, and when we're going to get to the revenue, you flip over and we expend 41, 42. So you make that difference up with ad valorem taxes.
Right.
Okay, my question is, we account for local expenditure of education dollars through ad valorem here in Union County, but if we're going to factor intergovernmental transfers in for restricted federal and state dollars to social services, health department, or whatever, why don't we factor the state and federal revenue that's produced to the schools in this equation as well, so we see the entire picture?
simply because those dollars don't pass through our books. Those are on your books. So if you take the 40, in this case, the 43.2%, and this is actually made up of two components. It's made up of the PAYGO funding, the PAYGO funding for capital, three components. The PAYGO funding for capital, the operating funding, and then the debt service for schools. But there is a direct in on your side of the revenue. So on your books, you show this intergovernmental revenue, I believe, from the local, from the county. So you would have the intergovernmental revenue on your side of the equation. This is only the part that goes out from us. Now, I've never seen, there are two different organizations, two different sets of books, so kind of amalgamating the two would kind of get really complicated and convoluted. But it just simply doesn't reflect here because it's not, it doesn't pass through us.
Right, right. And like I say, you'll have to forgive my ignorance, but I've always wanted to ask that question, and it came to me tonight. I was just curious how that correlated. So thanks for clearing that up for me.
No worries, always happy to answer questions.
Are we swagging over here too?
This is exact.
Okay. I'll get with you in a minute.
Okay. We don't carry it out too far in the percentages, but you can see this is kind of by service area where the money goes. For Union County Public Schools, it's about 43% of our total $355 million budget. And again, that's made up of debt service for schools, it's made up of current expense, and it's made up of capital. And there's about $200,000 of operations we pay for maintenance under central office, which it would be in that number, but it's not something you would necessarily see except in our budget. So, you have a question?
Okay, that brings up a question. I got to looking at these numbers, just trying to make in my head. And when I did the math, I looked at our current expense and our capital, and I had down for central office 1.7 million, and then debt service of 45 million, and I came up with 153,683.42 dollars, and we're about $40,000 off. So where am I missing the 40 grand?
The pieces you're missing.
Okay.
$1.7 million allocated to fund balance. Remember we did the smooth tax rate? I had the same problem because I started doing it and added up all the pieces.
Yeah.
And I said, I got to 151 million and change.
Okay.
Where's the difference? You go back, because we did the smooth tax rate and set the rate at 45.5 for essentially it's supposed to be over the 2 years. We're banking 1.7 for future. So that shows up.
That shows
in the
up
153.
here, but it's okay. But
it's not available until next year to be spent because it's smooth. It's a planned contribution to fund balance to smooth next year's budget.
The 1.7 million?
Yes.
that makes sense. Yeah.
But you're only off 40,000.
Well, but when I did the math that we were what I was talking about, I understand what you're saying now. I did
You
not.
swag pieces of it.
Okay, so, okay, but it make, okay.
Yeah.
I
So
got
once you
I
take
got
debt service, you
I got
take
Yeah.
the couple $100,000 that's paid for maintenance, you take all those components and add them together, because I did the same thing. Because I came to 151 and I was like, well, there's something missing.
Right.
And then I went back and looked and it was fund balance. It was appropriation to fund balance, which means we're banking that money for next year to keep the rates as level as possible because of the process. Does that kind of answer the question? Is that probably where you're
Same
headed?
thing.
Yeah, so. So as you can see, you go just around the wheel, Union County Public Schools, probably the single largest expense we have in the county. Then you kind of work your way around and you start human services, public works. Again, public works is all revenue backed. General county administration, that's a whole catch-all that covers everything that doesn't necessarily have a home. Your tax administration, your election office, the commissioner's office, just there's a whole host of different offices. The register of deeds, actually, the register of deeds shows up on this graph. There she is. So then, the sheriff's office is right at about 7.5%. So you can kind of see, you got to get an order of magnitude then of where all this funding goes, where all that funding goes. Keeping in mind, human services is largely paid for then by that dedicated revenue. The other piece of that dedicated intergovernmental revenue that I forgot to mention is Indian Trail and some other towns pay additional funds to have additional deputies. And that's encountered in that.
Yep.
I know you guys are probably tired of hearing from me, so unless you guys have any questions, that wraps it up.
Jeff, I promise I'm going to be brief. Got one quick question here. I want to go back to 2/3 bonds. And by the way, being in the construction industry, things are starting to pick back and heat up. So maybe your reval won't be quite as painful as we thought it would 18 months ago. But on 2/3 bonds, I mean, right now, the construction industry, it's still somewhat a buyer's market, but we're seeing the margins increase and costs are going up. How much money could we potentially leverage where we are now with an escalating tax rate on the GOBs that are out there for immediate construction needs? I mean, just.
I think when we looked at it, because we went through this scenario, I believe last fall, actually, it monetized to somewhere in the $14, $15 million, depending upon how you borrowed it and when exactly you borrowed it, because 2/3 bonds go across years. And if you plan it just right, you can maximize it. So you can create bigger project funds, borrowing them every other year, for instance, than you would if you borrowed it every year. When we looked at it, though, it was about 13, 14 million a year. It depends on the cascade kind of going across. But immediately, you could probably get to maybe 12 to 13 million, but then you also have the debt service.
Well, and like I say, speaking as a taxpayer, I know a lot of people had a bad taste in their mouth with the increase, and I would, on the heels of that, I would hate to go ask the taxpayers now to obligate more bonds. And it seems to be an expeditious way maybe to proceed on some of our immediate needs. And I was just curious what potential was in those 2/3 bonds. Like I say, I just wanted to make sure I understood that. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think now would probably be a good time to take a break and digest everything that we learned in Government Accounting 101.
Jeff, thank you for,
Does take 5
thank you for your
minutes. Thank you,
presentation.
Jeff.
Yeah.
We held it in school.
Give me a piece of paper. I'll write it out for you.
remember it because
We were doing all right till we found the more food in the room back there. So
Yeah.
We'll be back in just a minute. Give us 3 minutes.
where's he going? Where's he going?
what?
Where are you two going?
They're eating.
We're losing control already. Huh?
Just tell them all they want back and say, in conclusion.
That's good, Richard.
We have assigned all the duties to.
That's exactly right.
You got a quorum, right?
I got warm, but I got a headache. I got
Who's
a,
wrong? I want to ask Ron.
that was like a,
In fact, I was
like
trying
a
to
so
tell you was that's his little boy right there. And I told him, I said, is your daddy keeping you up? He looked at me and said,
Oh yeah, well that's what I said to him. I was like, "This is really fun, right?"
who? We're live. We're live.
Your mic is on. No, I.
Do we have a quorum? Should we start?
Mike, why don't you go ahead and get started here? We're
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Might get some money.
That's like, come on, please, Lord.
20 minutes, right, max.
Does anybody want paper copies?
Yeah, I know
Go
I
ahead,
do.
Mike, you start talking.
I feel like I'm at the board meeting, I get 10 minutes, right?
I'm sorry. We're going to put you first next time.
That's right.
Well, the teacher in me says that I need to go back and just do a little reflection on where we've been and so we can get to where we're going. So a little bit about the CCEP. Really planning for 2014 to 2020, and I'll be honest with you, that 2020 to 2022 to 2025. That's for this group to address as you're building a long-term plan for Union County. The Community Construction Equity Plan really looks at planning for stability. From the school system, we've heard from the parents that they want stability. We've got to address growth, albeit whether it's 1.5% or as high as the double-digit growth that we experienced earlier in the 1998 to 2005. We have to address the existing facility needs, and we need to look at future facility needs, whether that's replacement schools, whether that's new schools, whether that's additions to existing buildings.
It's okay.
So when we look at the plan, these are the stakeholders that need to be involved to create this long-term plan for Union County. We've involved parents. We asked all of our schools, all 53 schools, to work with their site-based teams, which include parents. We asked them to step out and involve community members to bring them in to address their needs, emerging needs, look at the comprehensive facility studies that have been out there, look at the comprehensive facilities plans, and look at emerging needs that may not be on those plans. We engaged the teachers that serve on those committees as well and reached out to them. Union County Public Schools, our facilities department's been involved, looking at mechanical, electrical, etc. And we have students that sit on those committees as well. Jeff talked a little bit earlier about public-private partnerships. We need to investigate and explore those opportunities. And this is where this working group sits. The Board of Education, the Board of County Commission, working together with all of these stakeholders to create this long-term plan for Union County Public Schools. And I believe that's what we're charged to do with this working group. We heard Commissioner Helms talk about wants and needs, and we all know that when you engage that many stakeholders and you're asking for their input, there's going to be some wants that come into the plan, and there's going to be a lot of needs as well. So I talked about the CFP, that's the Comprehensive Facilities Plan, and the CFS. All of those are going into what I would call the funnel. It goes to our facilities committee. Those ones in need, all of those projects dumped into the top of the funnel. The facilities committee will sit as the screen. They're going to pull out the ones. And then they will begin to prioritize the needs. And then it will go to the Board of Education, which will again have the opportunity to filter it one more time. And then, as a result of that, we'll have that list of approved community construction equity plan. That model yet to be determined. I don't know what those projects are going to be. I can tell you that we're going to get a stack of projects that's going to get filtered, and then we're going to have to take that list of projects and we're going to have to turn them over into a construction plan over a period of years, a period of time, based upon priorities.
I guess that's the question. Just to clarify for my own purposes. So what you're putting into that funnel then are all previous plans and analysis and evaluations that come before it. So once whatever comes out of the bottom of the funnel will be completed nature, so that it takes into account all the previous everything else. So there's not going to be any to get all those other studies. We'll be able to use that singular list to work off.
That is correct. We will have a single plan to follow, or a roadmap for Union County Public Schools and for our county to figure out how we're going to fund the project.
We can stop talking about all these acronyms and just have one.
That was really my question.
I knew it.
And again, the CCEP will focus on repairs, renovations, additions, new schools, replacement schools, and land acquisition. Because this model will go out over several years, we have to look at the growth factor. We have to study our demographers reports and see, are we going to have new schools, or will additions help with that stability and meet our needs?
And the CCEP will be updated annually.
Well, we have to be agile enough to adapt, because we may have a project in year 3, and Jeff talked about earlier, it's a year 3, and all of a sudden it's become a top priority because it deteriorated faster than we anticipated. And we've got to do that in year 1, or we've got to look at that 10% holdback, that preventative maintenance fund, to address it if we can. But yes, we have to be agile. The plan has got to be fluid, because what we said in year 5, 6, 7, whatever it may be, could come at us in year 2 or 3. Again, what I mentioned earlier, what is what's this group tasked with? Funding options. All potential funding sources and options. Jeff laid some of those out earlier today. We've got to develop that funding plan, and then we got to make a recommendation to the 2 boards. That's why I've got 6 years. I listed them as 14, 15. Well, we know 14, 15, that's 19.5 that we're working on. We know right now, 2015, 16 is 19.7 plus any true up that comes out the school system's way. Year 3, 4, 5, 6 to be determined, because you've got to work out the total amount of the projects that worked itself through the funnel, and then figure out how long we're going to move this plan out. It could be 6, could be 5, could be 10, based upon the size of the needs, because we got to make sure that we're good stewards with the funds that we are able to get from the county.
And I think we realize that it's unreasonable to ask for an astronomical sum in 5 years. That won't work with the county, with the taxpayer's ability to pay. So, Mike and I were talking today. This could very easily be a 7 to 10 year plan. That would be a roadmap that would have to have the give and take. So please don't take the 6 as the gospel. That's just sort of where it fell that time.
And this was a presentation that I had pulled from a board presentation earlier. That's why it just has the 6 on it.
Can I ask Jeff, and Ms. Cotto, is it then you could take these numbers and plug them into the county's long-term planning document?
And Mike asked me, I'm talking about this every year. We plan on a 6-year basis, bringing in the 6th year every year. So that's in line with our capital program.
And so then they can be married.
So they would be very soon. We wouldn't necessarily have a plan throughout beyond the 6th year, but we have lots of plans that are 20-year plans or 15-year plans. But yeah, we do our capital program is in that same allotment.
And they could be married in that way. That's the long-term multi-year thing that we're talking about that's renewable every year.
What it would enable county staff and the Board of Commissioners to look at as they're planning, this amount of dollars would come through, as Jeff had said, this could be bond projects, this could be PAYCO. And so you can move the dollars that best fits that year. And it may be a combination of sources or options to fund those years. So it's a plan for both the county and the school system. And it's one that I think we're charged with to do, or they come up with. Is there any questions on those 3 slides that I shared with you before I pull up the next set of decks? Really shows what I shared with the facilities committee. What in the world is this CCEP going to look like? It's an example. It's just an Excel spreadsheet to tell you how we're labeling it. I needed to get approval from the facilities committee to move forward. It is, I can't even fathom to tell you the number of hours that we spend just trying to collate, because we're pulling from the CFS, CFPs, schools, trying to make sure we don't have duplicated projects on there.
And what you're about to see is a draft. Big, all caps, all letters, draft. Nothing is written in stone. It has not gone to the facilities committee. It has not been vetted in any way, shape, or form. But I think Mr. Hadley and Ms. Bernard were interested in seeing some examples and the labeling and how we categorized. And
That's
that is,
right. Move your head.
I'm going to move my head. Well, I can't talk into the microphone and you see. So that is why we added these next slides, so you could get a taste of what we're talking about. We did this based on your request that Mr. Hadley told us about, so we make sure that you are very welcome.
The areas or categories we use to identify the projects. Again, remember, I'm pulling these projects from CFSs, CFPs, from site-based teams, so we needed to break them into categories. We're using structural, general construction, roofing, windows, and doors. Another category is life, safety, and security, plumbing, mechanical, electrical / technology, site issues that include things such as circulation, erosion, and drainage. We're also looking at AD issues and improvements, as well as equity of facilities and interior finishes.
Can I ask a question? Can you explain equity of facilities?
Yes, for example, we have newer middle schools that have an auxiliary gym. Our older schools don't have an auxiliary gym.
And there's a state mandated, I'm gonna move in just a minute. There's a state mandated requirement for physical education that we have to fulfill, and we have to rob Peter to pay Paul to do that when we don't have adequate spacing for that. And I'm not saying that's first priority on anything, but those are the kinds, it's an example.
When you look at the Excel spreadsheet, again, I'll show you the sample that I shared with the facilities committee here in a minute, but when it's been approved from the facilities committee on the 28th, you all will have access to review it. We've grouped them by using the following acronyms. You're going to see CFS means it came from the comprehensive facility study. SPT is a site-based team. We did engage our departments, so CN's child nutrition, CTs are career and technical education, JA is a jury award, and most of those came from the CFS as well.
What is CFS?
Comprehensive facility
The
study.
2009?
2009 document, yes.
Okay.
That's correct.
Yes.
700 pages.
The facilities that came from our facilities department, the maintenance review, the ASPs, our after-school program, and again, we looked at the 14 and 15 CIPs, which is your capital improvement plans. When the school sent in their spreadsheet, they had the ability to highlight it as green if it was really a site-based team, high priority. And times have changed. Red, it's a low priority. They may have put it on their list, but realizing that it's going to, the roadmap's going to be several years, so it was a low priority for them. That will help the facilities committee as they're looking at the project. It may make the list, but it may be in the last year of the plan. Here's the example. It's in Excel. The facilities committee, as well as the Board of Education, will have the ability to sort that spreadsheet by project. They want to look at all groups. They want to look at all restrooms. They want to look at everything in a school, Benton Heights. They want to look at everything in a cluster. They'll have the ability to manipulate the spreadsheet. They may want to look at everything that just comes from the site-based teams. Again, that's the way the spreadsheet's designed so that the facilities committee will be able to sort, identify, and prioritize these projects.
Would you please explain why some of them have no price on them?
Yes. Well, let me work myself across the spreadsheet. As you can see, the school, the cluster, there's the category. Remember, I shared with you the list of what the categories. There's the item. For this one, the canopies, add for main entrance and one wing. You can see it referenced. That means it's in a comprehensive facility study, so it has a reference associated with it. And according to their site-based team, that's a high priority for them. That's an estimated cost. Now, I will tell you, the estimated cost, if it was pulled from the CFS, was done in $2,009. So when we really go out to bid with these projects, we know that some are going to go up, more than likely. Some may have flatlined or even decreased some. As Dr. Ellis pointed out, why is there no price here with this project? Because there's no need for me to go out yet to price it unless it makes the list. Once it makes the list of priorities by the facilities committee, then we will seek a bid for that project, or at least an estimate cost of construction for that project. Hey guys, that's really it. That's just the sample. And again, the homework assignment for the facilities committee on the 28th, they will receive the first version of the CCEP in regards to every project. And then we will meet quite regularly. The facilities chairman and I have talked. We will have to meet quite regularly the month of February to, again, filter those projects down and begin to create the priorities to take to the full board so that we can bring this to you in March.
Now, when this document is finalized, and it's not yet, and we give it to the facilities committee, it is then a public document. And if this group wants it, we'll be glad to send everybody. Ms. Cotto will send it to you if it's okay, and you can give it to your folks, and we'll get it out so everybody can see what the first blush looks like, knowing that it will be filtered substantially.
Quick question. So let me make sure I understand this right. So each school then submits their top priorities, right?
Each school, that
school, each cluster, they all. Okay, so then, does anybody go through, is there a facilities committee, you all go through and then determine for the school district as a whole, what the top priorities are for the school district, or do we only figure out what the top priorities are for school and then try to allocate funds equally across the board?
No, we'll go through system-wide. We view it as a county-wide system. And based on some of the history, I mean, we're gonna ratchet down pretty tight. I mean, in the past, you've seen like, with the first facilities study, AstroTurf or a new field house or whatever, we'll call that sort of thing out. But basically, it'll be system-wide. This will be one document that'll have all schools covered. And when we did some of the safety and security stuff, you saw some of these kind of similar rankings that we did on it earlier when we negotiated some of that. And like I say, facilities basically go through and call this thing out. We'll work through it and then get it to the full board. It may be adjusted then. And of course, we'll be taking input from our other members that are sitting here. And then once we get it refined, we'll get it over to you. But yeah, it'll be a system-wide document.
So that goes to the equity of facilities. I guess that's the part that you'd be looking at. Because, okay, this is for Marvin. There are some schools that are considerably older, so they might get a lot more things that make it to our ultimate list as opposed to a brand new school. Like every school doesn't get 3 things.
Correct. And I mean,
Okay.
we basically have figured it out in the past, given priority to safety and security, structural, the actual house itself, and then say ADA needs. And then, you know, further down the list, you'll actually see where we start seeing some of those things that'll be lower priority. When we ferreted some of this out before budget wise, some of it never makes it out of the cut.
Okay.
But yeah, it'll be high priority so that we will, as a group, once we get here with it, you guys can take it, digest it, and say, well, you know, we've got these safety issues, we've got these structural needs, we've got these ADA needs. Now we've got the bulk of those important things covered. What else can we afford to do that may be like a canopy over a student drop-off or whatever? But that's the sort of thing I see maybe some of this group addressing.
And just to let you know, I sat on 2 site bases that went through this process. It's not just the top priorities. We walked the building, took an existing list that went back sometimes to the opening of the school or the cases. We walked the building, we talked with various stakeholders about needs, wants, desires, whatever the case is, and we put the entire list together, and that's what was turned into them. So it's not just top priorities, it's whatever that site-based team, which stakeholders from the entire school felt were the needs.
Those in green are top priorities.
For that
For the
school.
School.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
That doesn't
But
mean
it
it's
may
gonna
not
the
make
top
our cut.
priority for the
Yeah.
facilities committee.
Also, we know that we're going to have to do some additions to some schools. I mean, there's no getting around that. And part of what facilities is charged with are the maintenance in the facilities department, and then going to the facilities committee and the full board is updating with the demographer to look and see when we're going to need what additions and where they're going to need to be, and bring those to you also in the timeline.
Well, I really don't want to speak out of turn, but I mean, some of the numbers that we're seeing as far as school capacity is concerned, I'm very encouraged that we're looking, you know, right now, 5 years, 6 years out, and not really seeing a need for heavy brick and mortar. A few additions maybe, but hopefully unless building just booms, I'm hoping we're in a position that we can address some critical needs without having to expend a great deal of money on new brick and mortar.
Now, the additions would increase capacity. I think that was one thing I heard you say. It would definitely increase capacity and have to increase some core capacity with cafeteria, restrooms, and that kind of thing.
And again, Commissioner Davis, you are correct. Those are the school's priorities, but when it goes into the funnel, then the facilities committee will look at as a system priority. Okay. And I think the important thing that comes back there, once that list is down, and then we try to put it into a construction calendar, that will allow county staff and county commissioners to look at this total project, and this committee is what they've recommended, and see, you know, for us to eat this elephant, we need to take the small bites, and it needs to be a 7-year. It may need to be an 8-year plan. It's what we can afford as a system. But the needs are there, and they will be, we'll try to do our best to make sure there's enough time. I'm going to tell you, no matter how many times we filter that, everybody's definition of a need and a want can be different. But we will feel comfortable being able to justify everything to the county commissioners as well as to this community.
And just one last question, and I just want to make sure it's not all clarity. This includes all of these items.
CFS,
Everything
CFP.
that.
We'll have one, thank goodness we'll have one plan.
Okay. So every single thing that we've ever talked about the schools needing
Gone.
is in this report.
That is
If
correct.
an asteroid hits a building tonight,
All right,
will
good.
be as
There's a
good.
general fund for that, right? Isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say, with fund balance if the asteroid comes tonight.
But again, I think we have to keep in mind, we must be agile. Because when you start looking at a long-term plan, when you go out beyond 5 years, that's a challenge. I think your own staff would tell you that. We have to make sure our plan's agile enough that we can adapt and adopt as needed.
Well, and I think to your point, Dr. Webb, I think if we're communicating on that plan and we know that all of a sudden in year 2, we had to do something that we had to say for year 7, we know then that we got to make it up somewhere along the lines. And as long as we're communicating, we got that balance, I don't see us facing the issue that we found ourselves in.
And I will be glad to only have to remember one actor.
I'm sure you will.
You know, Commissioner Akins, that's one thing that I was talking with Commissioner Rushing yesterday, and I truly hope we as the Board of Education, if we have a need for a new school, I hope you know about it 3 or 4 years before we start talking about it. I mean, it's, I think we've been reactive far too long, so.
All right, let's talk about that. We engage a demographer every,
We'll engage a demographer this early spring, if not within the next 45 days.
to see if the trends are changing. So when we get the demographer's information, I think it will be incumbent upon the Board of Education to share that with the Board of County Commissioners, so you can look through the same glass, and this working group also, so you can see through the same glass that we're seeing with regards to trends. Because right now, we're thinking that, you know, the additions will be, we can get through for a few years with additions. But if another 10% growth comes in the next year or 2 years, that won't be.
And those numbers will be reflected in our enrollment forecast. We'll keep those updated each year so we can look at 5 years out.
And we have started giving Mr. Yates a report, or Dan, and different divisions do every 30 days. And I hope that has made it better for you guys to see where we are and in the light of day to know what we're doing. That's on your website?
It's posted on our website and our monthly management report.
Okay.
So it's on the finance website.
Are there any other questions? I'm finished.
I'd like,
Pam has a question.
that's not a question as much as a statement in the point you make about the growth and anticipating the growth. We've instituted some plans to increase our communication with our municipalities. One of the things that I heard last year a lot is that the left hand's not talking to the right hand. We'll be talking, the Board of Education and the county commissioners will be talking. So if we're talking to our peers and we pick up something out in the community that'll have an impact to you, we can get it to you. We can get it to you faster. And just trying to expand that communication across the county.
I agree wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Okay. Where are we?
Oh, jeez.
Okay.
We have,
We'll talk
we
at the
have
next
kind
meeting.
of,
I think we've hit all.
yeah, we
I think
kind
we've
of
done
hit
number
number
six.
six.
I think we've
as
done
we
number
went
6 as
along.
well, haven't we? Item number
Yeah.
6, I think we've really, we've
Yeah.
covered it.
Okay,
Don't
so
revive the
then,
horse.
Again, I'm very sorry.
Topics for our next meeting. There's some concern. I'm just going to say this. Some of you have approached me, and I'm sure Amy at the same time. We will continue to move forward with the CCEP, but that's still going to take time. And some folks are very interested is if we are able to see, and Richard, you might speak to this as well. Or I couldn't let someone else in here speak that I talked to, but nevertheless, as we move forward, if we see some idea of which would give us an idea on funding, dollars and cents, that we continue to move forward with the discussion of funding dollars or funding options. I think, Ms. Cody, you call it funding tools, but funding tools or options, whatever we want to call it. I don't know if I'm coming in loud and clear. If I'm not, I'll try to restate it. Are you confused?
Yeah.
Okay. we just want to be sure we have work to do together. And we have till the end of February, Mike, right? Before you start getting more information. And there's just the idea among some folks about, what will we be having to talk about if we don't have some dollars and cents kind of ideas of what may be coming and what options we may have to turn to.
What I think we're trying to say is if there is any way to have any partial information on the report, or do we have to wait for the whole report to be done? Is there any way to do it in any incremental or small bites, or is it not like that?
No, because the facilities committee, they have to have the entire report so they can really look to prioritize.
Okay.
So, but again, the list will be at the facilities Wednesday, January the 28th, and they will have that to work the month of February to complete it. And I don't know, it may not take the whole month. It depends on how aggressive we are working, number of meetings we have.
You will see what the total first blush ball of wax is, and it's going to be a number. It's probably going to be pretty scary. And you'll know it'll be a lot less than that. The last time this endeavor was undertaken, I think it started out, the comprehensive facilities study, if memory serves me correctly, was 283 million and some change, and it got whittled down to 90 million. So you can look at from where it started to where it ended up. So there will be, I feel certain there will be significant cuts to it before you even get it. But we're going to show you all of it, every bit of it, even before it's cut, not to scare anybody, but for the effort of, for full disclosure, so you can see every project that anybody has listed. And then after the March Board of Education meeting, Mr. Stewart, it should be voted on. So this group would have, after the March Board of Education meeting, they would have the final number that the board is going to submit. Yes?
This will be vetted before the March meeting, and the full board will have it at our March meeting. I assure you that.
With that in mind, I think it's a little premature before you have that vetted list to jump the gun on financing and funding options, because it's dependent on what's on that list as to the recommendation of the financing tools. I know we want to be active and we want to be sure it's a committee will go forward for charge, but also want to be sure and mindful that we have meaningful discussion and dialogue. And beyond what we did tonight, I don't think there's any, until we have that list, that there's a way to talk about capacity on how we would fund it until we know what it's going to be. So
Okay.
I think it's a fairly short order from the time we get the list to establishing a funding plan. I don't think that's a 2-month endeavor, but I think to work on it before that point would be kind of just wasted effort. So we get something hard and concrete to talk about.
Okay, that's good.
Does that answer for my?
Yes.
I think that just some folks in here that are so elated that there's such good health taking place here. And we talked about reconciliation, and we talked about cooperation, and we see that happening. And we just, some folks in here are so excited about it, just to continue to be sure we're moving in this direction.
We are moving faster than in my experience of working as a principal or in this capacity than we've ever moved with regard to that. I mean, we've truly expedited it for this working group. Now, I'm not a board member, but Mr. Stewart, you can speak as a member, but as a staff person, we have triple timed it to try to make sure this group would have meaningful time to do the work.
I have vowed to make the wheels of government turn more like business. So yes, we're going to expedite it. We're moving quickly. Sometimes they have to rein me back. But one question I forgot to ask a while ago. I know Commissioner Rushing was big on fines and forfeitures. Are you going to build the sheriff a new jail so we can start locking people back up and seizing bonds again anytime soon?
Court capacity?
Good.
Diverting people who don't necessarily.
Well, please encourage Mr. Robinson to revoke those bonds and keep those forfeitures and fines coming. Thank you.
Okay, so
Next meeting date. What do we think? What do we think? You came in loud and clear.
I think the week of the 9th is the first time.
Let me look right here. I don't even remember.
Shouldn't this be a meeting of March?
January. Well, March 3rd is supposed to be our meeting, but the board chair, who can't talk right now, but he and I have been in discussion about possibly having to change that meeting, and I don't want to steal his thunder. I would think the week of the 16th, would be fair game. The week of, but I bet that's a meeting for you guys, March 16th, isn't it? Then maybe the 17th on the,
No, you guys will meet on the 2nd.
Meet on the 2nd and 16th.
Yeah, 2nd, 16th.
well, maybe another,
Monday night this week, so.
Yeah.
As long as it's not Monday night.
the week of the 16th, and I'm just looking for eyebrows to make sure that the week of the 16th might be all right with our board. Yes, and I'm receiving a nod.
It's not St. Patrick's Day.
With the exception of St. Patrick's Day.
Yes, as long as we don't meet on the
When is St.
I
Patrick's?
can't do the 19th.
You got a conflict on the 19th.
How about the 18th?
March 18th.
What about the 18th?
I'm good. Wednesday night.
All right, now that's our, when the school system, when we talk about Wednesday nights, we talk about church nights. So we don't do much on Wednesday nights because we don't want to get in. I'm not trying to be funny. I'm being very serious. For a lot of people, that is a previous commitment. I don't know if I'm okay, but I didn't know about the rest that you're not.
I've retired.
You're tired.
We'll have a spiritual meeting that on the 18th.
All
I
in
promise.
favor of the 18th?
All right. Okay.
There we go.
We got it. Next meeting on the 18th.
Okay.
Can I ask where we're going to have it
Yeah,
and
I was
who's
gonna say, Ms.
hosting?
Coonan.
And because Cindy and I'll be scrambling a couple weeks before trying to, since we hosted this time, tag. Okay. And what time, Mr. Chair? Or
Yeah.
6:30.
We'll actually feed you.
Oh, will you? Oh.
I'm looking forward to it.
It'll be hard to top this one.
Cater it. Food was good tonight.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Okay, so March 18th, that
Yep.
probably a social hour at 6:30 meeting.
Yeah.
Your building?
Okay. Is there a motion for adjournment? We are adjourned. Thank you. Great work tonight.
Thank you.
folks. Wow. Wonderful, wonderful.